In medieval life, every sneeze, storm, or spoiled crop was blamed on curses or divine wrath. The medieval mindset was simple. Nothing just happened. Everything had a reason, and that reason was probably out to get you. If your bread didn't rise, it wasn't because the yeast died, it was because your neighbour Agnes looked at your dough with suspicious enthusiasm. If lightning struck a field, it wasn't bad luck. It was divine smiting, which, depending on your local priest, could mean either God was angry at sin or the devil was testing your patience. Either way, someone was getting blamed. If something bad happened, you didn't ask why. You asked who cursed me this time. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The average medieval person woke up every morning with one thought. Don't anger the invisible things. Spirits, saints, angels, demons, fairies, ghosts, and the occasional talking fox all had opinions about your behaviour. You weren't just living, you were tiptoeing through a cosmic minefield of offended entities. The fields, the forests, the rivers, even your house had rules. Step into the woods without saying a prayer and the fairies might steal your voice. Spill salt and you'd better toss some over your shoulder, unless you wanted Satan to join you for dinner. And people truly believed this. The world wasn't divided into science and superstition, it was superstition. The church taught that heaven and hell fought over human souls every second. So naturally, people saw divine fingerprints everywhere. The priest said the plague was God's punishment for sin, so when your neighbour's cows died, you nodded sagely and said, "Yes, that tracks." The irony, of course, is that the same priest might secretly wear a charm against the evil eye. Faith and fear weren't opposites, they were business partners. Life was an obstacle course of omens. If a bird flew into your house, it meant death was coming. If your candle blew out suddenly, the spirits were angry. If you dreamed of fish, congratulations. Someone you knew was pregnant. Medieval dreams weren't reflections of your psyche. They were prophecies with poor symbolism and worse timing. Every moment was filled with potential messages from beyond. And since no one wanted to miss a warning from God, people learned to see meaning in absolutely everything. Take the weather. A sunny morning meant blessing, but if a cloud passed over the sun too quickly, someone somewhere had probably sinned. Thunder was the sound of heaven rearranging its furniture, and comets were practically press releases for disaster. You didn't need a calendar to know what kind of year it would be. Just look up, panic, and prepare to repent. Superstition didn't just explain the world, it shaped behaviour. People avoided walking alone at night not because of crime, but because ghosts preferred late strolls. They whispered prayers before pouring ale, since fermentation could be ruined by bad spirits, literal ones. They even nailed iron horseshoes above their doors, convinced that iron scared away evil. You can imagine how confusing that was for blacksmiths, who made a living producing the very metal everyone thought demons hate. And then there were relics. Every church wanted its own miracle-working bone fragment or splinter of the true cross. Pilgrims travelled hundreds of miles to touch a saint's femur in hopes of curing gout, infertility, or general misfortune. Some relics were real, probably, but others were laughably fake. By the late Middle Ages, there were enough authentic fragments of the true cross to build an entire ship. The economy of holiness was booming and the belief was the currency, but it wasn't all gloom. Medieval superstition offered comfort in chaos. When you lived in a world with no antibiotics, no forecasts, and no reliable plumbing, the idea that someone, even an invisible someone, was in charge helped people cope. If you could toss salt, pray to a saint, and hang garlic to keep the devils out, then you weren't helpless. You were participating in the world's cosmic balance. Poorly maybe, but still trying. Of course, all this spiritual micromanagement made daily life exhausting. You had to remember dozens of taboos. Don't whistle indoors, don't spill milk after sunset, don't sing while eating, and for heaven's sake, never put your left shoe on first. One wrong move and you might wake up cursed, haunted, or suddenly very unpopular with your livestock. Imagine living in constant fear that your sheep were silently judging your moral choices. Superstition filled every gap where understanding failed, and in the Middle Ages, those gaps were enormous. The sun rose because God willed it. Disease struck because someone sinned. Fortune, fate, and free will were tangled in a divine web no one dared to untangle. If something went wrong, there was comfort in knowing it wasn't your fault, just your curse. It's easy to mock, but the truth is, superstition was medieval science. It explained what people couldn't yet prove. They weren't being silly, they were surviving. The world was terrifying, unpredictable, and dangerous. And superstition made sense of the chaos. It gave meaning to suffering, hope to fear, and structure to the unknown. Still, it must have been exhausting living in a world where the devil could hide in your soup. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so are the fleas, and they are probably cursed too. Next, we'll journey deeper into the medieval mindset, to a time when knowledge itself was suspicious and curiosity could get you branded a heretic. In other words, the era when science was considered witchcraft. Without real science, mystery filled the gaps. Natural events were branded as sorcery. The medieval world didn't need explanations, it needed culprits. If something fell, that wasn't gravity. It was a witch testing her curse range. If thunder cracked, that wasn't atmospheric pressure. It was God bowling with angels. And if your neighbour's bread rose higher than yours, it wasn't superior yeast. It was the dark arts of demonic gluten manipulation. Gravity? Witchcraft. Rain? Witchcraft. Your neighbour's bread rose higher than yours? Definitely witchcraft. You have to understand, Zumboabsons, this was an era where curiosity was practically a crime. Asking why something happened was suspicious. Asking how it happened was heresy. The universe was supposed to be mysterious because mystery kept people obedient. The church, the crown, and the local wise man all benefited from the idea that knowledge was dangerous. After all, if everyone understood how things worked, who'd bother buying holy water or paying tithes to avoid a thunderstorm? In medieval thought, nature wasn't a system, it was a personality. Rivers could be moody, forests temperamental, and the wind downright spiteful. The world was alive and not in a peaceful, poetic way. Everything around you was a potential accomplice to witchcraft. A sudden gust of wind could be a hex. A bad harvest meant someone had whispered to the earth wrong. Even an eclipse wasn't a predictable astronomical event. It was a heavenly warning that someone somewhere had angered the cosmos. There were no laboratories, only monasteries, and even the monks conducting early experiments often had to disguise their work as prayer. If you tried to study medicine, you weren't a scientist, you were a potential sorcerer. If you attempted to mix herbs and write down the results, congratulations, you were now one cauldron away from being burned alive. Curiosity could literally kill you, or at least get you a very nervous priest at your door holding a bucket of holy water and bad intentions. Take the example of astronomers. Medieval sky watchers who noticed patterns in the stars were often accused of tampering with God's design. The logic went something like this. If God wanted you to understand the heavens, he would have printed them in Latin and sold them at the church gift shop. The stars were divine business. Looking too closely was nosy. And yet a few brave thinkers did peer upward, scribbling quietly in the candlelight, hoping the Inquisition had the night off. Alchemy was the closest thing to science people had. Part chemistry, part mysticism, part enthusiastic nonsense. Alchemists genuinely believed they could transform lead into gold, cure every disease, and maybe live forever if they didn't blow themselves up first. They wore robes, muttered Latin, and mixed suspicious liquids, all while pretending not to notice the villagers outside calling them servants of Satan. To be fair, when your workshop keeps exploding and glowing green, you can't entirely blame the rumours. Even something as innocent as studying the weather could make people nervous. Meteorology didn't exist, but superstition filled the space. A sudden downpour meant witches washing their brooms, hail meant demons shaking out their bedsheets, and drought? Clearly the local peasants had skipped church one too many Sundays. Farmers didn't need a forecast. They needed forgiveness. And if the priest couldn't make the rain come, well, that's what witch trials were for. You just had to find the nearest woman with too many cats and a suspicious knowledge of herbs. The tragedy and dark comedy of this period is how easily fear disguised itself as piety. A woman gathering plants for medicine was seen as noble if she cured a nobleman's cough. But if she helped a peasant's pig give birth, witchcraft. The same action, different audience. Knowledge itself had a class system. Scholars and monks could read the stars, but a widow doing the same was accused of dancing with demons. The message was clear, wisdom was allowed, but only with permission, and superstition made sure of that. If someone read too much, people whispered they'd made a pact with the devil. If they built something impressive, people suspected sorcery. Even architecture wasn't safe of the stunning Gothic cathedrals that still stand today. To some villagers, those flying buttresses looked a little too clever to be human. You didn't get that kind of geometry without at least one demon consultant. But the funniest part is that medieval people didn't hate magic, they just wanted it to come from the right source. Holy magic was fine. Miracles, wonderful. Curses, terrible. Healing saints, divine. Herbal remedies, heresy. It was less about logic and more about licensing. Only God could break the laws of nature. Everyone else needed divine supervision and a receipt. Of course, all this suspicion slowed progress down to the speed of a snail with stage fright. Ideas that might have saved lives were buried with their inventors. Questions that could have changed the world were silenced with fire. But even then, curiosity never fully died. It just learned to whisper. Somewhere in a quiet monastery, a young scholar might still wonder why rain falls or why metals melt, writing notes in the margins like secret confessions to the future. And so for centuries, science and sorcery were indistinguishable. Both involved experiments, symbols, and a lot of smoke. The difference was whether your results impressed the church or annoyed it. If it was the former, you were a saint. If it was the latter, you were kindling. Next, we'll explore how this fear of unseen power created a world where everything, from bad dreams to broken tools, could be blamed on the devil himself. Because when science was witchcraft, the devil became everyone's favourite scapegoat. Satan was the universal scapegoat of the medieval world, lurking behind every stubbed toe and thunderclap. When bad things happened, and they usually did, people didn't ask what went wrong, they asked where the devil was hiding. Maybe he was in the storm that ruined your crops, or in the rock you tripped over on the way to church. Stub your toe on a rock, the devil put it there. He's got time, apparently. The medieval imagination gave the devil an impressive resume. He was the saboteur of crops, the cause of illness, the whisperer in dreams, and occasionally the reason your soup curdled. Nothing was too petty or too grand for his infernal meddling. If your cow went dry, that was Satan's mischief. If your beer went flat, same culprit. The devil was a full-time employee of chaos, and business was booming. In a world ruled by faith and fear, the devil wasn't just an abstract villain, he was a neighbour. People truly believed he prowled the earth looking for souls to snatch and hobbies to ruin. He appeared in art, sermons and bedtime stories as a constant reminder that evil wasn't somewhere else. It was everywhere. The devil could hide in shadows, disguise himself as a black dog, or even take the form of your overly helpful neighbour who just happened to know too much about herbs. Priests made sure no one forgot it. Sunday sermons were less spiritual guidance and more weekly horror podcast. Preachers described hellfire in vivid detail, lakes of burning brimstone, demons with pitchforks, sinners roasted like medieval kebabs. And people listened, trembling in the pews because the devil wasn't a metaphor. He was a reality you could meet on the road at dusk. Church art helped too. Stained glass and frescoes depicted him in all his monstrous glory. Horns, claws, bat wings, and a face that looked like it lost an argument with a frying pan. Nothing like a demonic jump scare to make people drop extra coins in the offering box. But the fear wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. Everyday life was a battle between divine protection and demonic sabotage. Farmers blessed their ploughs before planting. Blacksmiths made the sign of the cross over their forges, and mothers traced holy symbols on their children's foreheads before bed. These weren't quaint gestures, they were countermeasures in a cosmic war. The devil could be behind any misfortune, so prevention became ritual. A bad harvest wasn't bad luck, it was enemy interference, and sometimes people got creative in finding proof. Medieval courts were full of bizarre accusations. If your neighbour's crops thrived while yours withered, she wasn't just lucky. Clearly she'd made a deal with the devil. If your bread burned in the oven, maybe Satan was testing your patience. If your horse refused to move, perhaps a demon had hitched a ride. The devil's portfolio was as varied as it was absurd. The church leaned into this narrative because it worked. Fear kept people pious. The idea that evil was always watching ensured obedience. Every sin was an open invitation to demonic influence. You didn't just risk punishment, you risked possession. Gossiping too much? That's how it starts. One minute you're whispering about your neighbour's chickens, the next you're levitating and speaking in tongues. The most unsettling part is that medieval people genuinely believed they could see the devil's handiwork. A sudden illness, a strange noise at night, or a malformed animal birth. All were taken as signs of his meddling. Scholars wrote long treatises about how demons operated. They argued over whether Satan preferred to tempt through dreams or disguises, and debated if animals could be possessed. Spoiler, yes, according to them, your goat could be plotting your downfall right now. And then came the theatre of exorcism. The church offered deliverance from demonic influence, for a fee, of course. Priests performed elaborate rituals involving holy water, relics, and enough chanting to scare off both devils and sensible neighbours. The afflicted person might writhe, scream, or vomit up suspicious objects, all of which confirmed to the onlookers that evil was indeed real and worth tithing against. Nothing builds community like shared terror. The devil also served a useful political purpose. When kingdoms failed, crops died, or diseases spread, leaders could shift the blame downward to the people supposedly doing his bidding. Witchcraft trials, heresy hunts, and public burnings kept the devil's image alive while conveniently targeting anyone who questioned authority. Why face economic failure when you could just accuse someone of being in league with Beelzebub? But for ordinary people, the fear had a strange comfort. Believing the devil caused disasters meant someone was in control, even if it was a malevolent someone. The alternative, that the world was random and cruel, was far scarier. Evil could be fought with faith, prayer, and holy water. Chaos, on the other hand, had no rulebook. The devil's reputation grew with every century, evolving from a fallen angel to a medieval celebrity. He was painted into tapestries carved into cathedral doorways and performed in morality plays that warned children what happened to naughty souls. He became the ultimate scapegoat, the face of every mystery, every tragedy, and every misfortune. If life hurt, blame the devil. If life didn't hurt yet, he was probably planning something. In the end, Satan wasn't just a religious figure. He was the psychological glue holding medieval logic together. Every cracked wall, broken wheel, and burned pie had an explanation that conveniently fit into one phrase. The devil did it. And honestly, that kind of simplicity must have been soothing. Next, we'll venture into the business side of belief, where holy relics, saintly bones, and miracle-making body parts turned faith into a booming industry. Because if the devil was behind every problem, relics were the medieval equivalent of antivirus software. Overpriced, overpromised, and absolutely everywhere. Churches competed to display miracle bones, saintly teeth, and suspiciously generic body parts. Pilgrims crossed mountains and muddy fields to glimpse what was advertised as the authentic elbow of Saint Whoever. Holy relics were the medieval world's greatest franchise, part religion, part tourism, part early marketing scam. Medieval marketing, come see the third left rib of Saint What's-His-Name, miracles guaranteed or your soul back. In an age when fear ruled daily life, relics offered something rare. Hope you could touch. A tiny splinter of a saint's bone, a piece of robe, or even a drop of ancient blood was believed to connect the mortal world to the divine hotline. If you prayed beside it, you might be cured of illness, saved from fire, or at least get a better chance at not dying horribly. Relics were miracles in packaging, spiritual insurance policies encased in gold and incense. The trade in relics began innocently enough. Early Christians kept the bones of martyrs as sacred mementos, symbols of faith under persecution. But as Christianity spread, so did the relic economy, and soon demand wildly outstripped supply. You can only have so many saints before the bone market runs dry. Enter the age of creative sourcing. By the 12th century, Europe was practically overflowing with holy remains. There were enough splinters of the true cross to build Noah's Ark, and enough saintly fingers to make a whole choir of disembodied hands. This led to fierce competition. Churches weren't just places of worship, they were in the business of wonder. If your cathedral didn't have at least one miracle-producing knuckle or fragments of Jesus' sandal, you were losing pilgrims, and pilgrims meant money. A well-placed relic could transform a sleepy village into a booming spiritual hotspot. Inns, markets, and taverns thrived wherever the bones of the blessed were said to rest. Faith was good for the soul, but fantastic for the local economy. Monks became skilled entrepreneurs. Some wrote detailed catalogues of their relics, describing them with the same flair modern copywriters use to sell smartphones. Here lies the holy foreskin of our Lord, one abbey might claim, while another insisted they had the genuine article. Theologians actually argued over this. Imagine serious churchmen, robed and solemn, debating how many foreskins Christ could plausibly leave behind. Spoiler, there were reportedly up to 18 across Europe. That's not theology, that's brand confusion. But the most lucrative relics weren't always real. They just needed good stories. You could find the milk of the Virgin Mary, usually chalky water, feathers from angels, definitely geese, and thorns from the crown of Christ, imported from conveniently thorny bushes. The line between belief and business blurred spectacularly. Some merchants even specialized in relic smuggling, sneaking holy items across borders like divine contraband. When authorities cracked down, thieves defended themselves by claiming the saints wanted to be relocated. You can't argue with that, not without risking heresy. Pilgrimages turned these relics into tourist attractions. Devout believers trekked hundreds of miles to kneel before bones and glass cases. Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, and Rome became medieval theme parks of salvation. To see a famous relic was to earn spiritual points toward heaven, much like collecting cosmic loyalty rewards. Some pilgrims crawled on their knees for days to show devotion. Others bought certificates to prove they'd visited without actually making the trip. Early religious NFTs, in a sense. Relic-related miracles were a big business. Tales spread like wildfire about blind men who regained sight or soldiers saved from arrows after praying to a saint's jawbone. Whether these events were divine or placebo didn't matter. The faithful came, dropped coins, and spread the story. It was perfect marketing, intangible product, guaranteed demand, zero refunds. And if someone doubted a relic's authenticity, that conveniently was considered sinful. Churches went to extraordinary lengths to protect their treasures. Some displayed relics only on feast days, drawing enormous crowds. Others kept them locked behind gold and glass, revealed dramatically to the sound of choirs and bells. Pilgrims wept, kissed the cases, and left donations, not unlike modern visitors buying overpriced souvenirs after a light show. Theatrical faith was profitable faith. The irony was that while relics were supposed to elevate the soul, they often brought out the worst in people. Monasteries feuded, towns fought, and even kings schemed to steal relics from rivals. The theft of saints' bones was so common it got its own name, furta sacra, holy theft. But if you were caught, you could just claim the saint wanted to move, perhaps for better weather or improved foot traffic. It was divine real estate negotiation at its finest. Some relics even went on tour, carried through towns to bless crops or ward off plague. Imagine processions where peasants lined up to see a golden box while praying that their cows would stop dying mysteriously. The relic, naturally, got credit if things improved, and if they didn't, Well, maybe someone hadn't donated enough. Spiritual guilt, after all, was the medieval version of a subscription model. By the late Middle Ages, skepticism began to creep in. A few brave souls wondered aloud whether all these bones could truly be holy, especially since some saints appeared to have more skeletons in circulation than a modern anatomy classroom. But even doubters tread carefully. To question relics was to question the Church's authority, and that was an excellent way to find yourself accused of heresy, or worse, employed as kindling. Still, there was no denying the relic trade's impact. It built cathedrals, inspired pilgrimages, and helped define faith for generations. Beneath the absurdity lay something deeply human, the desire to hold on to hope, literally. When the world felt terrifying and unpredictable, clutching a saint's bone was reassurance that heaven was listening. The good news, relics gave medieval people comfort. The bad news, half of them were probably whale bones. But as long as belief held, so did the power. Next we'll travel to the Crossroads, on quite literally, where faith met fear, and people believed the night itself could open portals to the underworld. Because if relics brought heaven closer, Crossroads were where hell liked to hang out. Crossroads were seen as portals of darkness, where travellers risked spiritual hitchhikers. The medieval mind believed that where two or more roads met, so too did the realms of the living and the dead. Standing at a crossroads after sunset was less taking a shortcut home and more applying for possession. You couldn't even take a shortcut home without worrying about accidentally summoning a demon carpool. To the medieval traveller, crossroads were liminal spaces, thresholds between worlds. Roads themselves were risky enough, bandits, wolves, bad weather, and the occasional angry goose. But crossroads? They were cosmic danger zones. Spirits, witches, and devils were thought to gather there, attracted to the confusion of directions. The logic was oddly poetic. If even humans couldn't decide which way to go, surely the supernatural couldn't resist hanging around to meddle. Folklore across Europe agreed. You avoided crossroads at night, full stop. Travellers carried crosses, muttered prayers, or made elaborate detours that added hours to their journeys. There were countless stories of people who took the easy way home and ended up possessed, cursed, or found wandering fields days later mumbling about eyes in the dark. The moral was clear. Take the long road or risk the eternal one. It wasn't just fear of demons. Crossroads were also seen as places of restless souls. In a time before psychology, any unusual behaviour after dark was chalked up to ghosts with bad manners. People who died violently or were denied Christian burial were said to linger there. Trapped between worlds, crossroads became spiritual dumping grounds for the damned and the unburied. That's why suicides were often buried there. The church didn't want them polluting consecrated ground, and villagers wanted them far away. The crossroads, being no man's land, was a convenient spiritual landfill. But there was logic behind the superstition, twisted as it was. Crossroads symbolised uncertainty, a literal and metaphorical choice between good and evil. In a world obsessed with sin and salvation, standing at an intersection meant temptation. Which way do you go? Toward the church bells or into the dark woods? To the medieval imagination, that choice wasn't just geography. It was a moral test. Every path led somewhere spiritual, and the devil was happy to offer directions. Many folk tales tell of travellers meeting a mysterious stranger at a crossroads, a tall figure in black, often described as polite, charming, and suspiciously well-dressed for rural England. Spoiler, it's never a good sign when a stranger on a deserted road offers you success in exchange for anything. Deals with the devil were practically a genre of their own. One of the most famous legends, centuries later, was that of Faust, the man who traded his soul for knowledge. But the idea was much older. Medieval peasants believed the devil lurked at crossroads, offering shortcuts not just in travel, but in life. Want a good harvest? Power? A singing voice? Just sign here. In blood, please. In some villages, people built small shrines or crosses at intersections to counteract the evil influence, hence the term crossroads, literally, where a cross was placed to bless travellers. Others hung charms, lit candles, or sprinkled holy water before crossing. These rituals weren't eccentric, they were essential. The dark wasn't just dark, it was occupied territory. Every sound in the night was a negotiation with unseen forces. Ironically, the same crossroads that terrified peasants also became sites for secret rituals. Witches were rumoured to meet there under moonlight to cast spells or commune with spirits. Gravediggers might bury unwanted remains there. And some healers, on the fringes of faith, performed cures by standing in the centre at dawn and muttering incantations to confuse disease spirits. Crossroads were the medieval Wi-Fi hotspot for anything supernatural, open connection but terrible consequences. Even animals were said to behave strangely there. Horses balked, dogs howled, and crows gathered like gossiping spectres. If your horse refused to move forward at an intersection, the advice was not to whip it but to pray, because it clearly saw something you didn't. The idea that animals could sense the invisible added another layer of dread. You might not see the devil, but your donkey did, and it wasn't impressed. There's a darker undertone too. Crossroads often became places of punishment. Criminals and outcasts were executed or displayed there as warnings, their bodies left to rot as deterrents. The belief was that their souls, already damned, would guard the place against worse evil. Imagine walking home at dusk and passing a half-decayed body hanging beside a sign that said "Repent." No wonder people preferred getting lost in the woods. Despite the fear, crossroads fascinated people. They embodied everything medieval life revolved around, and choice, danger, and the eternal struggle between salvation and sin. Artists painted them, poets wrote of them, and storytellers used them as moral lessons. The hero who resists temptation, the fool who doesn't, and the traveller who vanishes into legend. Even centuries later, the motif survived. In folk music, fairy tales, and eventually modern myth, the crossroads remained where deals were struck and destinies changed. In truth, the medieval crossroads were less about geography and more about the psychology of fear. In a world where fate felt uncontrollable, the idea that evil gathered at certain places made life feel predictable again. You could avoid the devil if you avoided his favourite hangout. It was humanity's attempt to map morality onto landscape, to draw boundaries around chaos. The good news? Not every intersection spelled doom. The bad news? No one wanted to find out which ones didn't. So next time you imagine a weary medieval traveller trudging home under a pale moon, picture him pausing where the roads meet, clutching a charm, whispering a prayer and stepping carefully, just in case something was waiting for a ride. Next, we'll step off the road and into the doctor's tent where superstition wore a stethoscope. Because while crossroads might have cursed travellers, medieval medicine could easily finish the job. Physicians prescribed horoscopes and horse dung in equal measure, blending magic with malpractice. Medieval medicine was a curious hybrid of astrology, theology, and enthusiastic guesswork, a system where you might get cured or cursed, depending on which planet happened to be in a bad mood. There were no antibiotics, but plenty of hope, horoscopes, and horse droppings. The problem was simple. No one actually understood the human body. Dissection was frowned upon, something about respecting the dead, though honestly, it seemed more like fear of angering God, so doctors relied on imagination. Medical textbooks were filled with the illustrations of vaguely human shapes labelled with Latin words and celestial symbols. The body wasn't a biological organism, it was a miniature universe ruled by the stars. If Mars was ascendant, your blood ran hot. If the moon was high, your phlegm might rebel. Modern science calls it nonsense, the medieval world called it medicine. Before seeing a patient, a physician often consulted the heavens. Diagnoses began not with symptoms, but with astrology charts. Got a fever? Blame Saturn. Feeling depressed? That's probably the moon sulking. One popular manual even listed the best times to perform surgeries based on planetary alignment. Because obviously the key to successful amputation was making sure Mercury wasn't retrograde. The four humours ruled everything: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medical theory, every illness came from these fluids being out of balance. You were basically a walking soup recipe, and doctors were the world's least qualified chefs. Feeling weak, too little blood, cure leeches. Feeling angry, too much bile, cure fasting and prayers. Feeling cold, must be an excess of phlegm. Take this heated wine mixed with crushed owl feathers and hope for the best. Leeches were medieval celebrities. Every respectable physician carried a jar of them, ready to balance your health by removing several pints of your dignity. And if the patient fainted from blood loss, that was considered progress. Clearly, the humours were leaving the body. Medieval doctors didn't just treat illness, they auditioned it for sainthood. Surgery for its part was performed by barbers. Yes, the same men who trimmed beards. Their tools, razors, saws, and nerves of steel. Anesthetic options included alcohol, opium, or the faint hope that you'd pass out quickly. Pain management was often spiritual. Patients were told to think of the suffering of Christ, which is a poetic way of saying more, this will hurt a lot. For internal ailments, medieval medicine leaned heavily on herbs, superstition, and creative improvisation. Garlic was prescribed for everything from toothaches to the plague. It didn't work, but at least it kept your social life safe. Powdered unicorn horn was a favourite among the rich, though it was usually just ground-up narwhal tusk sold by enterprising merchants who'd clearly passed Business 101 at Scam University. Astrological diagnosis meant that every illness had a cosmic explanation. If you were born under Libra, your kidneys ruled your fate. If Venus governed your sign, romantic disappointment could cause indigestion, which, to be fair, still sounds accurate. Some doctors even claimed that surgery performed under the wrong moon phase would offend the stars and cause the wound to never heal. Patients didn't dare question it. After all, arguing with both the surgeon and the cosmos seemed unwise. And then there were the potions. Recipes combined herbs, minerals, and sometimes a dash of outright insanity. One 14th century remedy for headaches included powdered emeralds mixed with vinegar. For toothache, rub a dead mouse on your gums. No one ever explained why, perhaps to make the pain seem preferable. Plague cures ranged from eating crushed emeralds to bathing in rosewater and hope. A few desperate souls even inhaled the fumes of burning herbs, convinced that sweet smoke would repel bad air. Ironically, that last one came closest to working, though mostly because it distracted from the smell of death. Faith and medicine were intertwined. A doctor might bless a potion before handing it over, or prescribe confession alongside the cure. Illness wasn't just physical, it was moral. If you got sick, perhaps you'd sinned. So your treatment involved both herbs and humility. Hospitals were run by monks who believed prayer could cure anything except maybe disobedience. Healing the soul was priority number one, the body was a side project. Despite all this, the medieval physician wasn't a fool. He was simply trapped in a world without microscopes, germ theory, or hygiene. The idea that unseen organisms caused disease would have sounded absurd. Everyone knew it was either bad air or bad behaviour. Still, doctors tried. They took notes, observed patterns, and even developed a primitive understanding of contagion. They just also thought demons contributed. And while we laugh now, their patients weren't laughing, at least not for long. Treatments often did more harm than good. Bloodletting, for example, remained popular for centuries, proving that persistence isn't always progress. Yet somehow people survived. Maybe because of the herbs, maybe by accident, or maybe because human bodies are stubborn enough to outlive bad advice. Medieval medicine wasn't about curing disease. It was about restoring balance to a universe that made no sense. Each prescription, prayer, and horoscope was an act of faith against chaos. You didn't need proof, you needed hope. The good news, they genuinely believed they were helping. The bad news, they also believed horse dung cured baldness. But hey, at least it was organic. Next, we'll step into the jangling world of protection charms and amulets, where garlic necklaces, crystal bags, and dried toads weren't fashion statements, but life-saving accessories. Because in a world this dangerous, superstition wasn't optional. It was survival couture. People jingled through life armed with garlic bones and crosses to repel misfortune. In the Middle Ages, accessories weren't about looking good. They were about staying alive. Every pogorg, jingle, or odd smell you carried served a purpose. Protection from the invisible chaos constantly trying to ruin your day. Fashion tip: if you jingle while you walk, you're either protected or possessed. The medieval world was an open buffet for anxiety. Plague, famine, war, curses, and demons. There was always something out to get you. With so much spiritual danger in the air, people turned to portable protection. Charms and amulets were the wearable version of prayers, little talismans stuffed with faith, folklore, and the faint scent of panic. Some of the most popular charms were refreshingly simple. Garlic cloves hung around the neck to ward off disease and vampires. Small iron crosses pinned to cloaks to scare away evil spirits, and little pouches of herbs tied to belts like magical air fresheners. A traveller walking through town could sound like a wind chime made of desperation. One charm for sickness, one for luck, one for not being turned into a toad. Materials mattered. Iron was believed to frighten away demons, the medieval equivalent of pepper spray for spirits. Silver was said to repel witches and fairies, while bones and teeth, especially from animals, carried the power of the creature's vitality. The braver souls might even wear wolf claws or snake skins, as if to say, "I'm protected, but also mildly terrifying." For the wealthy, charms became a mix of faith and fashion. Jewelled crosses, gold pendants containing saintly relics, and lockets with miniature prayers inscribed in microscopic Latin. Of course, not all charms were blessed by the church. Many were what priests politely called borderline heretical, meaning they came from pagan traditions still stubbornly surviving under the Christian surface. People didn't see the contradiction. You could go to Mass in the morning, then buy a charm made from moonlight-blessed herbs that afternoon. Spiritual multitasking was common. God was good, but you never knew when he might be busy. Every social class had its favourite forms of protection. Peasants wore simple tokens, twine necklaces with carved runes or pebbles from holy wells. Knights carried religious medals into battle, convinced that a bit of saintly metal could deflect arrows more effectively than armour. Mothers pinned charms to cradles to protect infants from the evil eye, because apparently even babies had enemies. Sailors filled their ships with talismans, bones of saints, bits of rope from blessed bells, and seashells inscribed with prayers. Medieval insurance policies came in many shapes and questionable smells. And oh, the evil eye. That single glare of jealousy or malice was thought to cause sickness, ruin crops, or make milk curdle, a truly multitasking curse. To counter it, people wore eye-shaped charms, blue beads, or polished stones. Ironically, this sometimes caused the opposite problem: too many eyes staring back. You'd end up looking like a walking jewellery display of paranoia. But it worked, or at least people said it did. And that was enough to keep the superstition alive. The craftsmanship of charms was an art form. Monks inscribed protective verses on parchment and sealed them in metal tubes worn around the neck. Blacksmiths forged talismanic rings engraved with cryptic symbols. Some were even customized: protection against toothache, against storms, or against your mother-in-law's sharp tongue. The demand was endless, and as long as fear existed, business thrived. But these charms weren't just worn, they were activated. Every item needed a ritual. You couldn't just hang garlic and expect results. You had to bless it, recite the right prayer, and hang it facing east. Demons apparently had poor navigational skills. Amulets were charged under moonlight dipped in holy water or passed through incense smoke. Each object became a tiny spiritual battery, humming with borrowed power. The church had an uneasy relationship with all this. Officially, divine protection came from prayer, not accessories. But in practice, even priests wore blessed medallions, just in case. Some holy orders began producing charms themselves, carving crosses or bottling holy water for pilgrims. It was a clever compromise. If people insisted on wearing magic, at least let it come from church-approved sources. Medieval theology had entered the retail phase. Not all charms were visible either. People whispered protective words over food, scratched symbols on door frames, and tucked secret inscriptions into clothing seams. Some even carried amulets made from scripture verses written backward, a detail that feels either mystical or like someone misunderstood how reading works. Every superstition had a loophole, and everyone believed they'd found theirs. What's fascinating is how deeply psychological these objects were. They didn't actually protect anyone from disease, lightning, or demon cats, but they offered something just as vital, a sense of control. In a world where everything could kill you, having a charm meant you were doing something about it. It was medieval mindfulness. Instead of deep breathing, you clutched garlic and hoped for mercy. Travellers, especially, depended on their charms. Roads were long, dangerous, and haunted, at least according to every story ever told. Before leaving home, a traveller might be blessed by a priest, kissed by the relatives, and then fitted with enough charms to make a metal detector weep. The clinking of their gear wasn't just noise, it was a soundtrack of survival. And yet, there was humour in it all. Imagine a crowded market where every villager's charms clattered like an orchestra of hope and paranoia. One man wearing a rabbit's foot for luck, another clutching a pouch of dried herbs labelled anti-curse, and a third proudly wearing garlic like a knight's badge of honour. It must have smelled like faith and salad dressing. The good news, you could buy peace of mind. The bad news, it came in the form of something that jingled, reeked, and occasionally caught fire near candles. Still, for medieval people, the price was worth it. Next, we'll lift our eyes to the night sky, to the strange glow of superstition surrounding the moon. Because if charms protected you from earthly dangers, the moon was there to remind everyone that madness came in cycles, and full moons were the medieval version of brace yourself. Full moons turned men into beasts and sanity into folklore. The medieval night sky wasn't a silent spectacle, it was a warning sign, glowing ominously above thatched roofs and restless fields. The moon, pale and unpredictable, was the world's biggest celestial mood swing. Every time it reached fullness, people locked their doors, whispered prayers, and tried not to make eye contact with the heavens. Lunar science. When the moon's full, you too can blame your bad decisions on astronomy. The moon was both beautiful and deeply suspicious. It changed shape, it controlled tides, and it shone when everything else slept, clearly suspicious behaviour. Medieval people didn't need telescopes to know it was up to something. They just assumed it had opinions about their lives. A bright moon meant omens. A red one meant blood. An eclipse? Congratulations, the world was ending again. Every village had its moon law. In England, farmers said you should never plant under a waning moon, lest your crops come out stunted or demonic. In France, people avoided cutting their hair when the moon was full. Apparently, it made hair grow too fast, like botanical witchcraft. Across Europe, livestock were herded inside during full moons to prevent them from being bewitched by moonlight, as if cows were known to go on night rampages under lunar influence. But humans were considered even more vulnerable. It was widely believed that the moon could tug on the human mind just as it did the ocean, a concept that gave birth to the word lunatic, derived from lunar, meaning moon. Physicians solemnly wrote that the full moon disturbed the humours, unbalanced the spirit, and invited madness. If you acted strangely, you weren't unstable, you were moon-touched. It was the ultimate medieval excuse for questionable behaviour. Sorry I yelled at the bishop, the moon was full. Superstition made the moon not just a cosmic lamp, but a cosmic judge. Lovers confessed under it, witches worked by it, and sinners feared it. People claimed the moonlight revealed ghosts and spirits invisible by day. Travellers told stories of seeing a phantom procession drifting along moonlit roads, headless figures or spectral monks marching toward nowhere. And because medieval nights were truly dark, that silvery light slicing through clouds looked less like poetry and more like divine surveillance. Then there were the werewolves, the moon's most famous fan club. The myth of men turning into beasts under moonlight wasn't confined to Transylvanian horror. It was a pan-European panic. Peasants swore they'd seen neighbours transform after dark, their nails lengthening, their eyes glowing, and their appetite for livestock suddenly skyrocketing. Wolves were already terrifying enough, but the idea that one might also borrow your uncle's haircut was a whole new level of fear. Trials for lycanthropy actually occurred. People confessed under torture to roaming the countryside as wolves, attacking sheep, and occasionally nibbling on the odd villager. They weren't crazy, just victims of an age desperate to find moral meaning in every mystery. The full moon, bright and watchful, became the perfect scapegoat. It was easier to believe in cursed moonlight than in mental illness or coincidence. Priests joined the lunar paranoia, warning their flocks that moon-gazing invited temptation. The devil, they said, used moonlight as camouflage. Some monks even covered monastery windows during full moons, believing that excessive exposure could weaken one's virtue, as though sin travelled by beams of reflected sunlight. Others went further, claiming the moon itself was a mirror to the souls of the damned, glowing brighter the more sinners filled it. The night sky, in short, was a medieval sermon with better lighting. Of course, not everyone saw the moon as evil. Some healers believed it had powers of renewal. Moonlight baths were recommended for cleansing the soul, though one suspects that was mostly an excuse to bathe when no one could see you. Herbalists timed their brews to lunar phases, claiming that herbs gathered under the right moon absorbed celestial energy. It was half superstition, half early science, and entirely impractical when you're crouching in a freezing field at midnight muttering Latin to a plant. But perhaps the strangest lunar practice of all was moon divination. People stared at the moon's reflection in bowls of water, trying to read its shimmer for omens. If the reflection rippled, danger was coming. If it stayed calm, all was well. It's unclear how often this worked, but one imagines a lot of people were reassured until someone sneezed nearby and ruined the reading. The moon even had social etiquette attached to it. If you met someone under a full moon, you had to greet them first or risk being cursed with bad luck. If you saw the new moon through glass, it meant misfortune, so medieval households developed the habit of rushing outdoors to shout greetings at it directly, probably alarming their neighbours. Entire communities lived by the moon's moves like an unpredictable landlord who occasionally set your crops on fire. It's tempting to laugh now, but the moon truly was terrifying when the world was still mostly dark. Before electric light, its glow transformed everything familiar into something strange. The village square, the church tower, the forest path, all looked haunted. The moon wasn't just a symbol, it was a performance, one that made the whole world shimmer with uneasy magic. And yet, that fear gave life its rhythm. The waxing and waning moon told farmers when to sow and lovers when to meet. It governed festivals, fasts, and folklore. The same light that spawned tales of madness also inspired devotion. For every frightened villager hiding under blankets, there was another sitting quietly in awe, wondering if that glowing face in the sky was God's lantern or just a very nosy star. The good news? The moon made nights brighter. The bad news? It also made them weirder. When it rose full and heavy over the medieval landscape, people didn't just see beauty, they saw danger, destiny, and the uncomfortable reminder that the universe was watching. Next, we'll turn our gaze from the sky to the ground and look at the fluttering omens that carried messages from the beyond. Because in a world this superstitious, even birds couldn't just mind their own business. Birds became feathered prophets of fate, their flight patterns foretelling doom or laundry day. To the medieval mind, every flutter, chirp, or suspicious wing beat carried divine significance. The skies weren't empty. They were crowded with messengers, spies, and omens on wings. A crow meant death, a dove meant peace, and a pigeon meant laundry day. You could tell a lot about a medieval village by how people reacted to birds. A raven landed on your roof? Start planning the funeral? A swallow nested under your eaves? Congratulations, you've been blessed by a heaven's flying architects. If a bird flew into your house, you didn't think, windows are hard to see. You thought someone in this household is about to die. Then you politely asked the bird to leave, because apparently death respected good manners. Medieval people didn't separate nature from the supernatural. animals weren't just animals, they were instruments of divine messaging, like feathery emails from the afterlife. Birds, with their ability to fly between earth and sky, were especially suspicious. They could reach heaven. They could spy on you. They could, in theory, report back to higher powers about how sinful you'd been last Tuesday. The fascination with birds as omens went back to ancient Rome, where priests known as augurs interpreted bird movements to guide political and military decisions. Medieval Europe inherited this habit, but gave it a distinctly Christian twist. Instead of Jupiter sending signs, it was God, or occasionally Satan, depending on the bird's mood. Monks and scholars recorded which species brought blessings and which spelled doom, creating early bestiaries that read like paranoid bird-watching guides. Crows and ravens were the celebrities of the apocalypse. Their black feathers, croaking voices, and fondness for battlefield leftovers made them the ultimate symbol of death. If one circled above your house, people whispered prayers and shut their shutters. Ravens were believed to follow armies, a sure sign that battle and bloodshed were imminent. Some soldiers even claimed ravens spoke, mimicking human voices to deliver chilling prophecies. Nothing says morale boost like being told by a bird that you'll die before supper. Doves, on the other hand, had the best PR team in history. Ever since one carried an olive branch in the biblical flood, they became feathered ambassadors of peace and purity. Churches released them during festivals, symbolizing the Holy Spirit, though half the time the doves just flew home to their coops, proving that divine inspiration sometimes has a terrible sense of direction. Owls occupied a more complex niche. To some, they represented wisdom, quiet, nocturnal observers of truth. To others, they were shrieking harbingers of death. Their haunting calls echoing through medieval nights made for perfect ghost stories. Farmers swore that if an owl perched on a rooftop, the family inside would soon bury someone. It's unclear whether the owl caused the death or simply had impeccable timing. Then there were magpies, the medieval troublemakers. Seeing one magpie alone meant sorrow, 2 meant joy, 3 meant a girl, 4 meant a boy, and 5 meant something so vague people disagreed for centuries. Superstition dictated you greet a lone magpie with a salute to avoid misfortune. Imagine a countryside filled with people awkwardly saluting birds, all pretending this was completely normal behaviour. Swallows were good luck incarnate. Their arrival signalled spring, fertility and prosperity. Destroying a swallow's nest was basically asking for divine punishment. In some regions, people built tiny birdhouses near their homes just to attract them, a sort of medieval bird-based security system. Storks were similarly beloved. Their long migrations and family loyalty turned them into symbols of domestic harmony, and later in folklore, convenient delivery men for babies. Because clearly explaining childbirth was far less comfortable than blaming it on migratory birds. Birds even featured in medicine and fortune-telling. Some healers used feathers in rituals, believing they could carry illness away on the wind. Others watched the way flocks moved to predict the weather or political changes. A sudden silence among birds meant an approaching storm or invasion. Both were equally likely in the 14th century. In art and literature, birds futtied with meaning. A peacock represented pride, a sparrow represented the soul, and the humble chicken symbolized both cowardice and dinner. Medieval poets filled their verses with avian metaphors. Lovers compared their hearts to trapped birds, monks compared sinners to fallen sparrows, and cynics noted that pigeons had more sense than most nibbles. The world was a grand aviary of symbolism. Of course, not every bird encounter was poetic. Some villages developed elaborate rituals to counteract bird-based omens. If a blackbird crossed your path, you could neutralize the curse by spitting 3 times or spinning in a circle, ideally without falling into a ditch. Dead birds found on doorsteps were immediately burned or buried with prayers, lest they carry lingering bad luck. Birds weren't just seen, they were managed. The church, predictably, tried to control the narrative. Clergy preached that omens were distractions from true faith, messages not from heaven, but from the devil. Yet even priests hesitated when a raven croaked during Mass. You can condemn superstition all you want, but it's hard to ignore when it flaps into your sermon. Some cathedrals even carved birds into their architecture, both as decoration and, one suspects, as spiritual insurance. Behind all this feathery fear was something deeply human, the craving for meaning in randomness. When the world feels unpredictable, even a bird's flight can seem like divine punctuation. A lone crow on a fence became a cosmic text message. Brace yourself. It gave people a way to interpret fate, to feel less helpless beneath the chaotic skies. The fact that birds probably just wanted crumbs didn't matter. It's easy to laugh now, but for medieval people, birds were the original weathermen, psychologists and prophets rolled into one. They connected heaven and earth, turning every chirp into theology and every feather into philosophy. The good news? Birds gave meaning to the mundane. The bad news? A wrong flutter could ruin your week. So the next time you see a pigeon staring at you with suspicious intelligence, remember, in the Middle Ages, that was a meeting with destiny. Next, we'll descend from the sky into something far darker. The era when disease became a spiritual verdict and divine punishment took the form of black boils. Because nothing says repent quite like the plague. The Black Death was seen as God's wrath, not bacteria's triumph. When half of Europe began coughing, bleeding and dropping dead in the streets, medieval people didn't reach for disinfectant, they reached for prayer beads. Forget washing hands, people whipped themselves hoping God liked cardio. When the plague arrived in 1347, it came with no warning and no explanation, only death. Rats and fleas were the real villains, but no one knew that yet. To the medieval mind, such horror could only be divine. God apparently had reached his limit with humanity's nonsense. Entire sermons were dedicated to identifying which particular sin had finally pushed him over the edge. Was it pride, greed, lust, the general existence of France? The list was long, the theology uncertain, and the panic contagious. Cities became living nightmares. People died faster than they could be buried. Funeral bells rang so often they became the soundtrack of the century. Corpses filled houses, alleys and carts. The air itself seemed poisoned. With no scientific understanding of infection, explanations turned mystical. Bad air, miasma, was blamed. Air supposedly corrupted by sin, decay and cosmic displeasure. So people walked around holding flowers, burning herbs, or wearing beaked masks filled with spices. They weren't trying to smell nice, they were trying to survive divine deodorant. The church, normally the centre of comfort, found itself overwhelmed. Priests couldn't bury bodies fast enough. Monks died in their monasteries praying for forgiveness that never seemed to come. Yet rather than question God's fairness, people doubled down. Faith wasn't failing, humanity was. So repentance became obsession. Crowds marched through towns, flogging themselves bloody, chanting hymns, begging for mercy. They believed that if they could suffer voluntarily, maybe God would call off the apocalypse. These flagellants, as they were called, made penitence look like an Olympic sport. But the plague wasn't just a crisis of health, it was a crisis of logic. Doctors, caught between scripture and guesswork, came up with a parade of terrible ideas. Some advised avoiding baths because water opened the pores and invited plague. Others suggested drinking crushed emeralds. One creative soul proposed that loud noises could drive away disease, giving us perhaps the world's first medically recommended street festival. The few physicians who dared to experiment were often accused of witchcraft, because what other explanation could there be for trying to understand things instead of simply repenting for them? Meanwhile, entire towns resorted to mass prayers and processions. Candles burned for days. Bells tolled endlessly. And still, the dead piled higher. Every failure of faith only reinforced the belief that the punishment must be deserved. Inevitably, people needed scapegoats. When the world is collapsing, someone has to take the blame, and medieval Europe had plenty of candidates. Foreigners, beggars, and especially Jews were accused of poisoning wells or spreading disease through witchcraft. Pogroms erupted across cities as terrified mobs sought to purify their communities. The irony, many Jewish communities had lower death rates because they practiced ritual hand-washing, something the rest of Europe might have noticed. if they hadn't been too busy setting people on fire. The devastation reshaped society. Entire villages vanished. Labour shortages gave surviving peasants unexpected bargaining power, turning the feudal order upside down. Nobles who once saw themselves as God's favourites found their estates empty and their tenants dead. The plague became the great equaliser. You could be rich, pious, or royal, but the Black Death didn't care. It was the one time in history when "we're all in this together" wasn't just a slogan, it was an obituary. And yet the belief in divine punishment persisted. People didn't abandon religion, they made it louder. Churches were rebuilt bigger. Frescoes depicted the dance of death, skeletons leading kings and peasants hand in hand to the grave. Every painting, every sermon, every grave marker shouted the same message: no one escapes judgment. The world had become a cathedral of fear. Superstition filled the void that knowledge couldn't. Some believed cats carried the plague, tragically leading to the mass killing of cats, which, by eliminating rat hunters, made things worse. Others hung charms, wrote protective verses, or slept with relics under their pillows. Garlic, vinegar, and even roasted onions were considered defensive medicine. Anything that smelled strong enough to make you cry was assumed to scare the plague away. Amid the despair, strange forms of hope appeared. Survivors claimed visions of angels or saints who had spared them. These stories spread fast, offering comfort in chaos. Pilgrimages increased. People walked barefoot across continents to give thanks for still having lungs. When everything else failed, belief became the last cure standing. But the plague also planted a seed of skepticism. For the first time, ordinary people began to quietly wonder, if God controlled everything, why did so many innocents die? Why did prayers fail? Why did the holiest men fall first? These unspoken doubts would simmer for centuries, eventually feeding the fires of science and reform. In a grim way, the Black Death became the midwife of the Renaissance, an age born from death, desperate to understand the world rather than just fear it. Still, in the 14th century, no one saw enlightenment coming. They saw punishment. Every sunset was a sermon, every cough a confession. People didn't fear dying. They feared dying unshriven, without God's forgiveness. The plague wasn't just disease, it was divine performance art, terrifying enough to change the course of civilization. The good news, you survived another day. The bad news, your doctor still thinks crushed emeralds and prayer circles are an effective treatment plan. Next, we'll turn from mass death to the mysticism of math, because in a world ruled by signs and symbols, even numbers weren't safe. Some were holy, others cursed, and all of them had the power to decide your fate. Numerology ruled the mind. Numbers carried sacred or sinister meanings. To the medieval imagination, arithmetic wasn't a dry subject. It was divine code. Numbers weren't for bookkeeping or measuring your sheep. They were mystical symbols that revealed the architecture of creation itself. Each one had personality, purpose, and sometimes a very bad attitude. They didn't have math anxiety. They had math terror. The church told everyone that God created the universe with order and balance, so naturally, numbers became holy fingerprints. Every sermon, poem, and even recipe seemed to hide secret meaning. Counting was practically a form of prayer. Monks pored over scripture, convinced that the number of words, verses, and letters were divine messages waiting to be cracked. If your psalm had 7 lines instead of 6, that wasn't coincidence, that was providence. 3 was sacred, the number of the Holy Trinity. Everything designed to feel holy came in 3s: faith, hope, and charity. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Breakfast, lunch, and the inevitable penance afterward. Churches were built with triple arches and 3 aisles to reflect the heavenly geometry. Even artists obeyed the rule. 3 halos in a painting were inspiring, 4 made people nervous. 7, of course, was another favourite. There were 7 days of creation, 7 virtues, 7 deadly sins, and 7 sacraments. It was the spiritual Swiss Army knife of numbers. Medieval physicians also adored it. 7 metals, 7 humours, 7 ages of man. If something didn't fit into a group of 7, they'd make it fit. How many kinds of headaches exist? 7. How many ways can you offend a bishop? At least 7. It wasn't science. It was numerical loyalty. 12 carried cosmic weight too. The 12 apostles, 12 months. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 drummers drumming. It represented completeness, divine order, and probably exhaustion. Calendar makers, theologians, and astrologers all treated 12 as the universe's favourite default setting. When people looked at time, they didn't just see hours or months, they saw heavenly math in motion. But not all numbers played nice. 13, for instance, was the party crasher of the numerical family. Ever since Judas made it unlucky by being the 13th guest at the Last Supper, 13 became synonymous with doom. Dinner invitations capped at 12. Buildings avoided a 13th floor. And though no one in the 14th century could explain how chairs determined morality, no one wanted to test it. Even now that superstition lingers, all thanks to one ancient dinner gone catastrophically wrong. 6 had a mixed reputation. On one hand, God created the world in 6 days, very productive. On the other, 3 6s in a row spelled ultimate evil. Revelation 13:18 declared 66 as the number of the beast, and from that moment onward, every medieval accountant who totaled a bill at that figure probably broke into a cold sweat. Supermarkets didn't exist, but if they did, no one would have bought 3 loaves of bread at 6 coins each. Numbers also influenced architecture and ritual. Cathedrals were built to align with sacred ratios. Architects studied divine proportion, believing that perfect geometry could lure God's attention, or at least impress visiting bishops. The layout of altars, the number of steps to a pulpit, even the sequence of bell rings, followed numerological rules. Worship wasn't just about faith, it was about symmetry. If heaven had math, then the church would too. Even common folk obsessed over numbers. Farmers timed planting with lunar cycles and counted days between weather shifts, convinced patterns hid divine clues. Fortune tellers used number charts to predict personality and fate. Born on the 3rd of the month, you're destined for grace. Born on the 13th, don't unpack. People carried their birth numbers like passports through a world of invisible arithmetic. Astrologers, meanwhile, blended math with mysticism so thoroughly that even scholars got dizzy. They assigned numbers to planets, angels, and even illnesses. The number 9, for instance, belonged to the moon, mysterious, emotional, and occasionally prone to influencing cheese prices. Kings hired mathematicians not just for taxes, but for prophecy. Entire wars were postponed if an unlucky number appeared in the date. Numbers didn't just count the days, they decided them. Books and manuscripts reflected this numeric obsession. Illuminated texts glimmered with golden ratios and elaborate grids. Margins were filled with calculations meant to mirror the perfection of creation. Theologians like St. Augustine argued that numbers were the hidden language of God, proof that the universe wasn't random but carefully coded. To study arithmetic wasn't about trade, it was a devotional act. You weren't learning math, you were learning divine grammar. Of course, there were skeptics, a brave few who dared to say, maybe sometimes a number is just a number. They tended to be ignored unless their crops grew better that year, in which case everyone decided they were in league with the devil. Superstition about counting itself ran deep. Counting people out loud, for example, was thought to tempt death. Shepherds avoided counting their sheep directly, fearing it might invite loss. Instead, they muttered coded words or skipped numbers altogether. One popular rhyme went something like 1, 2, many, God bless the rest. It wasn't bad math, it was good survival. What's astonishing is how far this reverence for numbers shaped thought. Mathematics, mysticism, and morality blended until they were inseparable. Every sermon echoed with numeric structure. Every symbol corresponded to a quantity. Even hell had arithmetic, so 7 circles, 9 orders of demons, endless as calculations of eternal suffering. If heaven ran on harmony, hell, apparently, was an Excel sheet that never ended. The good news? Numbers gave meaning to chaos. The bad news? You couldn't escape them. Even your sins came pre-numbered. For a civilization obsessed with finding divine patterns, arithmetic was less a tool and more a theology. Counting, in a sense, was praying, as long as you didn't reach 13. Next, we'll step into the era's darker fear. When those same sacred numbers led people to search for devils in their neighbours. Because once you start believing evil has patterns, it's only a matter of time before you start counting witches. Every thriving garden or lucky chicken was evidence of demonic partnership. In the paranoid theatre of medieval life, you didn't need a broom or a bubbling cauldron to be accused of witchcraft, just good crops and bad timing. If your neighbour's herbs grew too well, congratulations, you live next to Satan's gardener. The medieval witch wasn't the cartoon crone of Halloween, at least not at first. She could be the old woman who sold herbs, the widow who lived alone, or the midwife who knew too much about childbirth. In a world where ignorance masqueraded as holiness, knowledge, especially the practical, earthy kind, was suspicious. Anyone who healed a wound, cured a fever, or made a potion that actually worked must have had help from somewhere infernal. For centuries, the church had quietly tolerated folk magic, blessing cattle, brewing herbal skull teas, muttering charms for good weather. These were just rural traditions, half pagan and mostly harmless. But as Europe's faith deepened into fear, superstition grew teeth. By the 13th century, theologians began redefining magic not as superstition, but as rebellion, a deliberate alliance with the devil. And once you gave fear a face, it started multiplying. The witch panic didn't explode all at once, it simmered. Rumours spread through villages. Someone's butter wouldn't churn, someone's crops failed, someone's baby cried too long. Clearly, the work of dark forces. People wanted explanations that made emotional sense, and witchcraft fit every mystery like a cursed glove. No one wanted to admit their cow died of disease or their bread went mouldy because of poor hygiene. It was much simpler and more exciting to believe a neighbour hexed them out of jealousy. Witchcraft accusations followed familiar patterns. The accused were often women, poor, unmarried, or simply unpopular. Independence was its own kind of sin. An outspoken widow could become unnatural in the eyes of the village. A woman with no husband but a full pantry. Clearly she was getting her groceries straight from Hell's farmer's market. In a society obsessed with moral order, the witch became the perfect scapegoat for everything unpredictable, from storms to spoiled beer. Trials were community theatre at its most tragic. The accused might be dragged before local courts, questioned by clerics, and subjected to tests that made as much sense as a drunken horoscope. If you floated in water, you were guilty, because water, being pure, rejected you. If you sank, you were innocent, but also drowned. If you confessed, you were condemned. If you refused, you were obviously hiding something. It was a winless logic, so like arguing with a bureaucracy run by demons. What's striking is how these beliefs blended folklore and theology. In peasant imagination, witches didn't just curse neighbours, they flew at night, danced with demons, and milked cows from afar using enchanted ropes. Scholars later added Sabbaths, midnight meetings where witches supposedly worshipped the devil, kissed his backside, yes, that detail appears in records, and plotted evil against the church. Most of it was hearsay stitched together by clerics who clearly spent too much time indoors. Yet the hysteria felt real. Whole towns turned on themselves, hunting invisible enemies. Whispered rumours became accusations, accusations became confessions, usually under torture, and confessions became proof. The witch hunt wasn't about evidence, it was about emotional release. In times of plague, famine, or war, fear needed a target. And that target was almost always the woman who made her own soap. Witch hunting manuals soon appeared, the most infamous being Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487. It claimed to identify, expose, and eradicate witchcraft, and read like a paranoid fever dream. It blamed women's weaker faith for their supposed susceptibility to Satan, described absurd magical crimes, and provided interrogation tips that guaranteed guilt. The book sold faster than reason could recover. Its message was clear. Evil wasn't rare. It was next door, probably watering her basil. Fear of witches blurred with fear of nature itself. Storms, disease, and crop failures became moral events. Why did the river flood? Because the witch angered it. Why did lightning strike the barn? Because she looked at it funny. The world turned into a divine courtroom where every tragedy was evidence. In such a system, no one was safe, especially those who seemed too lucky, too clever, or too alive. But beneath the absurdity lay something revealing. Witch hunts weren't really about magic. They were about control. They policed behaviour, gender, and deviation. The witch was everything the medieval world feared in a person. Independent, mysterious, ungoverned by men or priests. In persecuting her, society reaffirmed its fragile order. The witch's pyre burned not just her body, but the idea of defiance itself. Still, superstition is a resilient beast. Even as reason began to creep into Europe, the image of the witch endured. Artists painted them with flying hair and boiling cauldrons. Writers turned them into moral lessons. The irony, of course, is that most accused witches were herbalists, the closest thing their world had to scientists. The same people condemned for sorcery were the ones actually experimenting with medicine, agriculture, and chemistry long before universities took an interest. And yet, the fear worked. For centuries, people tiptoed through life terrified of offending unseen forces, or worse, of being mistaken for someone who could command them. The witch next door was never far away, because she lived in every fear of the unfamiliar, every suspicion of difference, every refusal to believe that nature could simply happen. The good news, the witch craze eventually burned out. The bad news, it took thousands of innocent lives and centuries of hysteria to do it. But in the ashes of superstition rose something unexpected. Curiosity. Once the smoke cleared, people began to ask the dangerous question that witches had always asked first. Why? Next, we'll enter the dark courtroom of medieval justice where proof and pain were the same thing. Because when fear ruled the law, trial by fire wasn't a metaphor. It was an afternoon activity. Medieval justice proved guilt through torture disguised as divine truth. It was an age when pain was considered a reliable polygraph test and injury a form of divine messaging. Forget lawyers, forget evidence. If you wanted to prove your innocence, you had to survive it. If you sink, you're innocent. If you float, you're guilty. Either way, bad day for swimming. The medieval courtroom was less law and order and more God's reality show. People believed that divine justice was literal, that God would intervene to protect the innocent. So naturally, they invented ordeals, tests so brutal that survival alone was taken as a miracle. The logic was simple and horrifying. If you lived, God had spoken. If you died, well, at least the truth was clear. The ordeal by water was a classic. The accused, or often a suspected thief, adulterer, or witch, was bound and tossed into a river. The thinking went that pure water, a symbol of holiness, would reject the guilty. If the person floated, it meant the water had spat out a sinner. If they sank, they were innocent, because the water had accepted them. Rescue was supposed to follow swiftly for the innocent, emphasis on supposed to. Medieval life had many flaws, and quick reflexes weren't one of its strengths. Then there was the ordeal by fire, a medieval favourite for its dramatic flair. The accused might be ordered to hold a red-hot iron bar, walk barefoot across glowing coals, or plunge a hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. The wound was then bandaged and inspected 3 days later by a priest. If it healed cleanly, divine proof of innocence. If it festered, well, you might want to start composing your last prayers. Of course, considering the hygiene standards of the time, Fester described just about every wound ever. In other cases, justice took the form of the ordeal by combat. When reason failed, which was often, the sword stepped in. Two disputing parties fought until one yielded, died, or realized this was a terrible life choice. The belief was that God would grant victory to the righteous. It didn't matter if your opponent was twice your size and armed with a halberd the size of a tree. Clearly, your lack of survival skills reflected your moral standing. But even these weren't the strangest methods. The ordeal by ingestion involved making the accused swallow sacred bread or cheese blessed by a priest. If it stuck in their throat, they were guilty, because obviously God managed the esophagus directly. There was also the ordeal by the cross, where two people stood before a crucifix with their arms outstretched. The first to lower their arms lost the case. It was justice by endurance, part trial, part medieval workout routine. Behind all this absurdity lay a sincere conviction that the divine would not allow injustice. Ordinary people couldn't rely on human fairness. Too many bribes, too many nobles, so they turned to God's judgment, physicalized in pain. To them, suffering wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. The body became the courtroom, the wound the verdict. The church both encouraged and complicated this system. Priests blessed the ordeal equipment, presided over trials, and interpreted results. But by the 13th century, even Rome began to grow uneasy. Maybe, they suggested gently, God wasn't particularly fond of being summoned to micromanage hot irons and river drownings. In 1215, Pope Innocent III officially banned clergy from participating in ordeals, which technically ended the practice. Technically. In reality, local courts simply rebranded them as tests or proofs, because bureaucracy loves semantics. The nobility, meanwhile, adored trial by combat. It combined theology with sport. Disputes over land, honour, or insults could be settled with armoured carnage, attended by cheering crowds. Knights rode into these judicial duels convinced that God's will favoured better swordsmanship. And if they lost? Clearly the other man's righteousness came with a sharper blade. Some duels even featured women, though fairness was not exactly the theme. One account describes a man waist-deep in a pit, armed with a club, fighting a woman who wielded a rock in a sock. It was justice medieval still, horrifying, awkward, and somehow legally binding. Even peasants had their versions. Local disputes could be resolved with ordeals of balance, where accused thieves were weighed against sacred objects. If you were heavier than a Bible, guilty. If lighter, innocent. One assumes the skinniest villagers suddenly became very pious. Every region had its ritual, each more creative than the last. Medieval Europe had turned divine judgment into a slapstick contest of endurance. And yet, for all its madness, these ordeals gave people something they desperately needed: certainty. The world was chaotic, laws uneven, and justice easily bought. But pain was honest. No one could fake survival. If someone walked barefoot over hot coals and lived, that was proof enough. In a grim way, these trials reflected faith in divine fairness, a faith so absolute it burned, boiled, and drowned its believers. Modern readers might laugh, but to medieval minds, ordeals were less barbaric than relying on human judgment. You didn't need clever arguments or noble connections, just courage, faith, and perhaps a high pain threshold. The poor found comfort in believing that even against lords and bishops, they could still have God on their side. Admittedly, that side came with severe third-degree burns. The good news? Justice was theoretically equal. Anyone could suffer for the truth. The bad news? Truth tended to scream, bleed, or sink before it was proven. Medieval justice, in its tragic irony, wasn't about finding fact. It was about reaffirming belief. The courtroom wasn't a place of reason. It was a stage where faith took the witness stand and God was expected to show up on time. Next, we'll move from the courtroom to the mirror and explore the world's oldest social curse, envy. Because after surviving fire and water, the next great danger was subtler, a simple jealous glance that could ruin your life. Envy was lethal. A single glare could curse cows, crops, or reputations. The medieval world didn't believe in bad vibes. It believed in weaponized eyeballs. You didn't just worry about haters, you worried they could kill your cow with a dirty look. It all began with one of humanity's oldest insecurities: jealousy. The medieval mind considered envy not just a sin, but a supernatural hazard. When someone gazed upon your good fortune, your fat sheep, healthy baby, or particularly fine turnip, their admiration could morph into destructive energy. That jealous spark shot through the eyes, became the malus oculus, the evil eye. And once it hit you, your luck, health, and livestock were finished. People lived in genuine fear of the envious stare. A proud parent mightn't hesitate to praise their own child aloud, lest someone listening think, "How lovely," and unconsciously curse them into a fever. Compliments, obtained in fact, were dangerous territory. "Your cow looks healthy" could translate to, "Your cow will be dead by dawn." The safest way to admire anything was to follow it up immediately with a blessing. "God protect it," a medieval verbal antivirus. The evil eye's power was democratic. Anyone could cast it, often unintentionally. You didn't need to be a witch or sorcerer, just resentful. Poor people were especially feared, since their envy of the rich was thought to pack extra spiritual punch. In some regions, even priests were suspected of harbouring the evil eye, since their gaze was considered so potent that one disapproving look could dry up your luck like a sunburn. The idea that jealousy could manifest physically turned the entire village into a quiet competition of pretending not to notice each other's success. Protection rituals were everywhere. Babies, considered the most vulnerable, were practically wrapped in superstition before they were wrapped in blankets. Mothers pinned charms, shells, or tiny metal crosses to their infants' clothes. In some places, they smeared ashes or soot on the child's forehead, not for fashion, but to make the baby look less adorable and therefore less enviable. Ugly but alive was considered excellent parenting. Animals too got their share of magical accessories. Farmers hung charms from cow horns, tied blue ribbons to horses' tails, or even burned herbs under the stables to dispel the look. A successful dairy herd might sport more talismans than a royal procession. It was an agricultural arm race against invisible jealousy. Different cultures had their own defences. In Italy and Spain, people made the corner, a hand gesture resembling devil horns, to ward off the evil eye. In the Middle East, the Hamza hand symbol was a popular charm, while in Northern Europe, iron again made an appearance. Keys, nails, or small horseshoes were hung at doorways to block envious stares. In many places, people relied on the colour blue, believed to repel the curse. Blue beads, blue embroidery, blue thread. Medieval Europe looked like it was under permanent construction by Team Azure. Some protections were purely auditory. People spat muttered blessing, or whispered nonsense syllables whenever something good happened, to confuse lurking spirits. The logic was oddly practical. If evil forces couldn't tell what was happening, they couldn't ruin it. The same principle explains why peasants sometimes renamed their children after they got sick. A spiritual witness protection program against the evil eye. And if prevention failed, well, cures were plentiful, if not pleasant. Folk healers might boil herbs, recite psalms backward, or pass the victim 3 times through smoke. Sometimes they'd burn an egg near the afflicted person, and inspect the ashes for traces of the eye. Others believed you could identify the culprit by placing silver in holy water. If it tarnished, you'd found your envious neighbour. It's unclear how many people admitted guilt after a tarnished spoon, but the practice certainly kept silversmiths in business. The belief in the evil eye wasn't just paranoia, it was a social system. It enforced humility and modesty in communities that valued conformity. Boast too much, and you risk curses. Prosper too openly, and envy might literally strike you down. The superstition acted as medieval social media moderation. Don't flex your wealth unless you're fine with cosmic backlash. Religious authorities had mixed feelings. The church frowned on folk magic, but couldn't quite stamp out the evil eye. It was too universal, too human. Priests began offering holy water and blessings as official countermeasures, effectively baptizing superstition. Confessors even warned against sinful envy, linking the moral and the magical. The result? Everyone feared envy twice, once from others and once from God. What's fascinating is how gender played into it. Women were often blamed as the chief carriers of the evil eye, especially elderly widows, the usual suspects for anything suspicious. Their piercing glances supposedly wilted crops and soured milk. In reality, they probably just had opinions and cataracts, a dangerous combination in an age allergic to female independence. Men, meanwhile, could defend themselves with charms or sheer arrogance, a double standard still recognisable in modern superstition. Even art and architecture tried to fight back. Churches and cathedrals often featured grotesque faces, gargoyles or carved eyes at their entrances, not merely decorative, but apotropaic, designed to return the gaze of evil. Every monstrous grin chiselled into stone was essentially saying, "We see you too." The entire medieval skyline became a massive spiritual mirror, reflecting curses back at their senders. And of course, the superstition adapted to everyday humour. A farmer whose neighbour's cow fell ill might joke that it had caught an eye. Merchants who lost a shipment might blame an envious competitor's stare instead of bad weather. It became a cultural reflex, part fear, part satire. After all, when disaster could strike at any time, blaming the eyes of others was easier than admitting the world was just random. The good news: belief in the evil eye made communities more cautious about pride. The bad news? It also made everyone deeply suspicious of eye contact. Compliments required disclaimers, babies came accessorized like miniature knights, and even chickens wore ribbons. The medieval world lived under constant surveillance, not from kings or churches, but from the imagined power of jealousy itself. Next, we'll explore the strange rituals people used to keep that bad luck at bay, from spitting 3 times to turning in circles, because when superstition ruled, looking foolish was safer than looking cursed. From spitting thrice to hanging horseshoes, superstition became a second religion. Medieval life was so full of invisible dangers that people armed themselves not with swords but with rituals, little daily acts of defence against fate, demons and suspicious weather patterns. It wasn't enough to pray. You also had to spit, knock, circle, chant, and occasionally throw salt like a holy chef in panic. Medieval self-defence: aggressively spit your way out of misfortune. Rituals filled the cracks where logic feared to tread. The average villager didn't just believe the world was full of curses, they believed curses were personalised. The universe had mood swings, and you had to stay on its good side, so before setting out to work, people made signs of the cross, muttered blessings, or touched bits of iron to ground their luck. The blacksmith, the baker, and even the town drunk shared the same philosophy. Better to look foolish than cursed. Take spitting, for example. This was the Swiss army knife of medieval superstition. Spit once for good luck, twice for protection, and thrice to really drive your point home. People spat to ward off jealousy, to bless newborns, or to protect brides on their wedding day. Entire ceremonies involved discreetly spitting behind your shoulder, often followed by a prayer, the medieval equivalent of just behave. To an outsider, Europe must have looked like one large, unhygienic, synchronized dance of anxiety. Another favourite: knocking on wood. Trees were thought to house protective spirits, so tapping or knocking on them was like giving a polite heads-up to the local guardian. It said, "Please don't let me jinx this," or in modern terms, "Universe, ignore what I just said." In some regions, people even whispered secrets into hollow trees, believing the wood would absorb gossip before it reached malevolent ears. Somewhere, a forest full of oaks was groaning under the weight of everyone's bad decisions. Then there were the horseshoes. Iron was already considered demon repellent, but when shaped like a crescent, a symbol of good fortune, it doubled as supernatural security. Hanging one above your door invited luck in and kept evil out. The direction mattered, though. Some said it should point upward to hold luck like a cup. Others said downward to pour blessings over visitors. Medieval homeowners argued about this the way modern people argue about Wi-Fi routers. Salt, meanwhile, was holy dust. Precious, pure and preservative, it was used to seal covenants, bless less food, and, most importantly, neutralize bad energy. Spilling salt was practically a cosmic emergency. If it happened, you had to toss a pinch over your left shoulder to blind the devil waiting there. Nobody explained why the devil preferred that side, but the rule was universal. Kitchens everywhere became battlefields of seasoning and superstition. Fire and smoke were other protectors. People waved burning herbs over their heads to cleanse the air, lit candles to chase away spirits, and carried glowing embers from one home to another as symbols of shared luck. On special nights, villagers even jumped over bonfires for purification, an activity that sounds spiritual until someone's tunic caught fire. Still, for medieval people, danger was a part of the charm. You weren't truly safe unless you risked a little bit of combustion. Rituals extended into every corner of daily life. Travellers refused to start journeys on certain days, blacksmiths refused to forge on others, and pregnant women avoided graveyards entirely. To whistle indoors was to summon mischief. To cross your cutlery meant conflict. To drop bread was to invite famine. And if your candle went out unexpectedly, it wasn't a draft. It was a ghost announcing bad news. Even something as innocent as sneezing came with a mini-ceremony. Everyone shouted, "God bless you," as though your soul had just tried to escape through your nose. Animals got their own rituals too. Before milking cows, farmers whispered charms over the pail to prevent witchcraft from souring the yield. Shepherds made the sign of the cross over lambs. Even bees were addressed politely. If a beekeeper died, someone had to tell the hive, or the bees would fly away in mourning. In medieval cosmology, etiquette extended to livestock. Offend a cow, and you risked more than bad milk. You risked spiritual scandal. Many rituals had pagan roots quietly adapted for Christian comfort. Turning 3 times in a circle was once a sun symbol, later rebranded as a Trinity blessing. Sprinkling water before a harvest had been an offering to fertility spirits before it became a Christian thanksgiving. Religion and superstition were so intertwined that most people couldn't tell where one ended and the other began, and frankly, they didn't care as long as the crops stayed alive. And while some rituals were communal, bonfires, blessings, processions, many were deeply personal. A merchant might rub his coin purse with basil before trading, convinced it attracted fortune. A young woman might braid red thread into her hair to protect her dreams. A soldier might carry a pebble from his village into battle. These gestures stitched comfort into the fabric of daily terror. In a world without explanations, ritual was a kind of conversation with fate, a whispered please to the unpredictable. It wasn't all grim, though. Superstition had its comic side. Imagine a medieval dinner party where someone spills salt, knocks on wood, spits, and turns 3 times before resuming conversation. Or picture the morning rush as villagers perform their personal routines, muttering over bread, touching iron, checking for their lucky charm before heading to the fields. The whole of Europe moved through life like one giant anxiety ritual, a continent of nervous hope and dedicated silliness. The good news, these habits gave people a sense of control in a world designed to scare them. The bad news, hygiene, productivity and logic all suffered. But in a society where disease, famine and demons shared equal billing, superstition was the ultimate multi-tool, protection, comfort and entertainment all in one. Next, we'll peek into the world of dreams, those nightly voyages where angels, demons and too much cheese fought for stage time. Because in medieval beds, even sleep wasn't safe from divine interpretation. Dreams were divine messages or demonic warnings, depending on breakfast. The medieval sleeper couldn't just close their eyes and hope for rest. They were stepping into spiritual open mic night, where angels, saints, and the occasional satanic prankster all wanted to perform. Every dream was a potential telegram from heaven or hell, and interpreting them was a national pastime. Dreamed about cheese, either divine blessing or lactose intolerance. toss a coin. To a medieval person, the dream world wasn't imaginary or humbury. It was another dimension entirely. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was travel. Your body stayed in bed, but your soul took a field trip through the unseen realms. You might meet saints, glimpse purgatory, or chat with your deceased uncle about eternal damnation. People believed the soul could roam freely at night, collecting secrets from the spirit world, which was a poetic way of excusing snoring fits and sleepwalking. Naturally, everyone wanted to decode these nocturnal messages. Scholars, monks, and mystics wrote entire manuals on dream interpretation. One popular book, Sommial Danielese, The Dream Book of Daniel, claimed to list what every symbol meant. Dreaming of a river, expect peace. Dreaming of fire, trouble. Dreaming of a rooster, pride. Unless the rooster was singing hymns, in which case you were probably having a stroke. With thousands of entries, the book turned bedtime confusion into organised paranoia. Dreams were classified into 3 categories: divine, natural, and demonic. Divine dreams were visions from God or the saints, often guiding the dreamer to perform some heroic or pious act, like building a church or confessing that lie about borrowing your neighbour's ox. Natural dreams came from digestion and mood, a polite medieval way of saying you ate too much cheese. Demonic dreams were the ones where things got weird: seductive strangers, terrifying beasts, endless staircases. Those weren't just nightmares, they were considered soul traps laid by the devil to tempt or torment. The church took dreams very seriously. Some saints' lives were built entirely around their visions. Joan of Arc, for instance, claimed to have heard divine voices and seen heavenly figures in her sleep, a claim that later doubled as her death sentence. Pilgrims flocked to monasteries where monks were said to receive divine dreams like nightly newsletters. A holy man who dreamed about a village was often believed to be its new spiritual guardian, whether he wanted the job or not. Of course, not every dream was treated with reverence. Common folk experienced a nightly tug-of-war between faith and fear. Dream of falling. The devil was dragging you. Dream of flying. Clearly witchcraft. Dream of your teeth falling out. Someone close to you was about to die, or you just needed medieval dentistry, which was the same thing. Sleep wasn't relaxing, it was psychological roulette. Dream incubation was a curious practice for those who wanted specific answers. Before sleeping, a person might pray fast, or sleep on a church altar to invite a vision. It was like scheduling a divine appointment. Merchants sought dreams about business luck, farmers about weather, and nobles about heirs. Occasionally, someone claimed success. A saint appeared, offered advice, and vanished in a flash of incense. More often, people just woke up hungry, cold, and no wiser than before. Nightmares had a category of their own. They weren't just unpleasant, they were entities. The mare in Nightmare wasn't a horse, but an evil spirit that sat on your chest, stealing your breath and sanity. People described waking up unable to move, feeling crushed by an unseen weight, what we now call sleep paralysis. Medieval folks didn't blame brain chemistry, they blamed demons. To prevent such visitations, people slept with crosses over their beds, knives under pillows, or even garlic necklaces, because if it worked for vampires, why not for night terrors? Prophets and seers also claimed dream communication. Kings kept dream interpreters among their advisors, men skilled in spotting divine meaning in royal naps. If the king dreamed of a lion, it meant victory. If he dreamed of falling off a horse, it meant scandal or taxation, depending on how the treasury was doing. Entire wars, marriages, and coronations were influenced by the sleep habits of powerful men with too much imagination. Animals occasionally starred in these prophetic dreams too. A talking ox could predict famine, a snake signalled betrayal, and a talking chicken meant you needed better wine before bed. Even colour mattered. Red dreams meant anger, green dreams meant growth, and black dreams, well, those meant you should start updating your will. The funny thing is, while most people feared their dreams, others chased them. Dreaming became a mark of holiness, especially for mystics and visionaries. Monks wrote dream diaries to track divine communication, complete with sketches of angels or infernal beasts. Some even shared their dreams at breakfast, because nothing pairs better with porridge than a vivid story about purgatory's interior design. But dreams were double-edged. They could elevate or condemn. Too many visions and you risked being labelled possessed. Too few and you were spiritually deaf. The church walked a fine line between encouraging faith and pleasing imagination. Visionary women, often nuns, were admired for their piety but also watched closely for heresy. God's message was always welcome, as long as it didn't contradict church policy. For ordinary people, dreams remained both comfort and curse. They turned private fears into public meaning. A mother might dream of her son at sea and rush to church to pray for him. A farmer might dream of locusts and reinforce his granary. Dreams became a survival tool, a way to prepare for the unpredictable world ahead, even if the only real danger was indigestion. The good news: dreams made medieval nights more interesting. The bad news: so did the demons. In a society obsessed with divine signs, sleep wasn't an escape. It was another battlefield between heaven and hell, with your subconscious caught in the middle. Next, we'll wander from the bedroom to the back alley, where people tried to peek at their futures without waiting for bedtime. Because if you couldn't rely on dreams, you could always hire a prophet, palm reader, or fraud with excellent confidence and terrible hygiene. Every class sought their fate in stars or chicken guts, paying in livestock and fear. For all their churches, relics and rituals, medieval people still wanted something more personal than sermons, a sneak peek at tomorrow. Your future? Poor, plague, and probably possessed. That'll be 2 chickens, please. Fortune-telling was the unofficial side business of every medieval village. Some did it for money, others for survival. People feared uncertainty more than sin, and if the church offered salvation in the next life, fortune-tellers sold clarity in this one. Their tools? Anything from the heavens above to the entrails below. Astrologers were the most respectable of the bunch. They wore robes, owned books, and spoke confidently about planetary alignments, the medieval version of scientific authority. Kings and nobles swore by them. Before a war, a royal astrologer might be asked whether Mars favoured conquest or indigestion. Marriage dates, coronations, even childbirths were planned by the stars. If Saturn was grumpy that week, important business waited. Whole kingdoms paused for cosmic mood swings. For the less literate crowd, palm reading was the go-to method. A palm reader could turn any dirty hand into a map of destiny. Each line had meaning: the line of life, the line of love, the line of "you haven't washed in a month." If your hand was short and thick, you were practical. If long and slender, you were wise. If missing a few fingers, your future was short but eventful. People found comfort in believing their fates were literally in their hands, or at least in someone else's greasy ones. Then there were the more earthy prophets, haruspices, heirs to ancient traditions, read the future in animal entrails. Chickens, goats, and sheep all unwillingly contributed to the cause of foresight. The priest of prophecy would spread the organs out and interpret their colour, shape, and, no joke, steam patterns. A healthy liver might foretell victory. A shriveled one meant disaster. Somewhere in Europe, a man in a cloak was getting paid handsomely to stare at goat guts and frown meaningfully. Even ordinary folk dabbled in small-scale divination, tossing pebbles, flipping coins, watching candle flames, or pulling random verses from the Bible, sortilege, all served as DIY prophecy. If the flame flickered, a visitor was coming. If it went out, death loomed. Fortune-telling was the medieval search engine, slow, unreliable, and often terrifyingly accurate by coincidence. Not all predictions required props. Some seers claimed to dream their revelations. Others went into trances, muttering cryptic phrases that their followers eagerly deciphered. The most ambitious spoke in tongues, claiming angels dictated their forecasts, a good way to sound convincing while saying absolutely nothing. Of course, not everyone approved. The church officially condemned divination as consorting with the devil. Only God, they said, knew the future, and anyone claiming otherwise was either deceived or demonic. Yet bishops secretly consulted astrologers. Monks quietly drew star charts in their margins. It was spiritual hypocrisy at its finest. Faith banned fortune-telling, but curiosity refused to die. Among commoners, fortune-tellers played a complicated role. They were feared, needed, and occasionally beaten. Villagers might hide their visits, sneaking under moonlight to the local wise woman's hut for answers. She might read cards made of wood or bones, chant a rhyme, and promise protection, always for a modest fee or a fresh chicken. If her predictions came true, she was gifted bread and thanks. If they didn't, she was accused of witchcraft. It was a high-risk career path, medieval customer service with mortal stakes. Superstition made every trade part-time prophecy. Sailors read the colour of dawn to predict storms. Farmers looked to animal behaviour before planting. Midwives used charms and chants to forecast the health of infants. Even blacksmiths checked sparks. Bright ones meant good luck, dim ones meant demons. The entire medieval workforce was quietly moonlighting as oracles. Some forms of divination were more theatrical. Bibliomancy involved opening the Bible at random and reading the first verse as divine advice. Spiritual roulette with eternal consequences. Casting lots meant tossing dice, bones, or carved sticks and letting fate arrange the results. The lots of destiny were popular among both peasants and nobles, because nothing makes you feel in control like leaving your future to dice blessed by a guy who just coughed into his hands. Prophecy also became political. Rulers loved having their reigns justified by seers. Every ambitious noble could find a fortune-teller willing to predict that yes, destiny had personally chosen them for greatness, conveniently payable in advance. Medieval Europe was built on the delicate balance between divine right and decent marketing. Yet for all its fraud and spectacle, fortune-telling served an emotional truth. Life was fragile. Famine, plague and war struck without pattern. Knowing the future, even falsely, offered structure. A prophecy could ease fear, restore hope, or justify revenge. People didn't really want accuracy, they wanted meaning. The good news? Fortune-tellers made the world feel understandable. The bad news? Most of them guessed. But in a time when survival itself was uncertain, even a guess wrapped in ritual was worth a chicken or two. The stars, the palms, the guts, they all promised a universe with logic, however strange. Next we'll turn to the unluckiest demographic of all, those born with the wrong hand. Because in the Middle Ages, being left-handed wasn't quirky, it was practically a criminal record. Left-handed people were branded sinister and spiritually suspect. In the medieval world, if you favoured your left hand, you weren't just unusual, you were suspicious. Being born left-handed was basically being born suspicious. You might not have chosen the devil's side, but your handwriting certainly did. The fear of left-handedness was baked deep into medieval culture, linguistically, religiously, and even architecturally. The Latin word sinister literally meant left, and it also meant unlucky or evil. Its opposite, dexter, gave us dexterity, adroit, and good job, you're not cursed. The right hand was associated with strength, blessing, and divine favour. The left, trickery, deceit, and probably demonic influence. In short, medieval people thought God was right-handed and the devil was a southpaw. From childhood, left-handers were corrected, which in medieval terms meant discouraged through guilt, fear, and possibly sticks. Teachers, priests, and parents worked tirelessly to force children to write, eat, and bless themselves with their right hands. Using the left was more than odd. It was impolite, irreverent, and a bit heretical. Crossing yourself with the wrong hand might as well have been sending the signal directly to Satan's inbox. Even gestures carried moral weight. In art and sculpture, angels were depicted giving blessings with their right hand, while demons gestured with their left. Saints faced right in holy murals. Sinners slouched left into the fires of hell. Heaven in paintings was on God's right, hell, predictably, was on his left. You didn't need a compass to find your moral orientation, just look at your thumbs. Social rituals reinforced the bias. When you greeted someone, you extended your right hand, both as a sign of peace and to show you weren't holding a weapon. The left hand, however, was considered unclean. Why? Because medieval hygiene had a designated division of labour, and the left hand drew the short, unsanitary straw. It was the hand used for personal hygiene, no need for detail, which made it permanently ineligible for bread, blessings, or handshakes. Being left-handed meant spending your life apologising for anatomy. Religious ceremonies added another layer of superstition. During baptism, the priest poured holy water with his right hand, symbolising divine grace. At Mass, blessings were given with the right hand, and sinners were instructed to avoid using the left for making the sign of the cross. Even entering a church carried choreography. Step in with your right foot first for luck, step in with your left. You might as well start confessing early. Medieval medicine didn't help. Physicians, still loyal to the four humours, claimed left-handedness resulted from imbalanced humours in the brain, specifically an excess of black bile, the humour linked to melancholy and madness. To cure it, some parents made their children sleep on their right side or tied their left arm down during lessons. The goal wasn't kindness, it was conformity through mild torture. Even warfare had a right-hand bias. Swords were designed for right-handed use. Shields were worn on the left arm. Left-handed knights had to adapt or die stylishly early. The positioning of castle staircases, spiralling clockwise, was intentionally built to give right-handed defenders the advantage in combat. Attackers coming up the stairs had to fight with their weaker hand while defenders comfortably slashed downward. Architecture itself took sides. Left-handedness wasn't just inconvenient, it was seen as an omen. A person who stumbled out of bed onto their left foot was doomed to a bad day. Birds flying from the left were harbingers of misfortune. Even dreams involving the left side foretold trouble. Farmers refused to harness oxen starting from the left, fearing their crops would wither. In a society obsessed with symmetry, the left hand was chaos in flesh form. Of course, some tried to find loopholes. A few scholars argued that left-handers were not cursed, but mysteriously chosen. Maybe, they suggested, God simply worked in mirror image. But these voices were rare and whispered, because nobody wanted to be caught defending what was widely seen as the devil's brand. Left-handed people learned to hide their natural tendencies, or face ridicule, suspicion, or worse, of a priest armed with corrective holy water. The irony is that many famous medieval figures appear to have been left-handed: artists, swordsmen, and even scribes. Illuminators, who painted the ornate borders of manuscripts, sometimes left brush marks that betrayed their left-handedness. Yet because anonymity was common in medieval art, history conveniently forgot their names, perhaps proving that the right hand not only blessed but also edited the past. The Church's fixation on the right hand even extended to afterlife imagery. On Judgment Day, the saved would stand on God's right and the damned on his left. It was cosmic segregation by hand preference. If you were left-handed, you could only hope heaven had room for nuance, or that the angels were open-minded about ergonomics. And yet, beneath the superstition lay something deeper: fear of difference. The left hand was merely symbolic of everything society couldn't categorize. It represented unpredictability in a world desperate for order. To medieval thinkers, if God created perfection on the right, then anything left over must belong to someone else, someone red, horned, and fond of brimstone. The good news, left-handedness eventually survived, more cool, barely. The bad news, it took victories to rehabilitate a hand's reputation. Still, one can't help but admire the quiet defiance of those medieval left-handers who refused to switch sides, who stirred their porridge, wielded their quills, and made their blessings backwards. They were living proof that even in an age obsessed with symmetry, the human spirit still dared to write its own rules, one awkward flourish at a time. Next, we'll move from hands to halos, and see how the medieval world's obsession with signs of holiness led to a booming market in miraculous nonsense, because if you couldn't trust your left hand, at least you could buy a saint's toe for protection. Knights carried charms and avoided cursed days, mixing valour with paranoia. Chivalry might have looked like courage on horseback, but behind the polished armour was a man who wouldn't even draw his sword if the stars were wrong. Nothing says bravery like refusing to fight on a Wednesday because it's unlucky. War in the Middle Ages wasn't just a matter of strength and steel, it was a spiritual gamble. Every battle was believed to be a test staged by heaven, with angels and demons as invisible spectators. Victory wasn't credited to tactics but to divine favour, and defeat wasn't bad luck, it was God unsubscribing from your moral plan. To avoid that fate, soldiers surrounded themselves with as much supernatural insurance as they could carry. Before a knight rode into battle, he didn't just polish his armour, he blessed it. Crosses were engraved onto shields, swords were sprinkled with holy water, and banners were anointed like they were VIP passes to paradise. The church sanctioned this pageantry eagerly. Crusaders marched beneath relics and saints' bones, convinced that if holiness didn't stop at arrows, it might at least improve morale. Some knights even tied Bible verses inside their helmets, as if a psalm tucked near your forehead could deflect a spear. But not all protection came from God. Soldiers, especially common footmen, relied on charms, talismans, and good old-fashioned superstition. Bits of bone, strands of hair from a lover, and coins engraved with crosses filled their pockets. Some sewed tiny amulets into their tunics, scraps of parchment inscribed with blessings or battle words like Deus Vult, God wills it, or Pax et Victoria. It was medieval camouflage for the soul. Timing mattered too. Certain days were lucky, others deadly. Fighting on a Friday, the day of Christ's crucifixion, was risky business, while Sundays were considered holy enough to discourage combat entirely. Mondays were mixed. Some knights thought it marked new beginnings, others swore it cursed campaigns with chaos. And then there was Wednesday, the dreaded middle child of the week, long associated with Mercury, the god of trickery, and therefore bad omens. It didn't stop wars, but it did delay quite a few of them. Medieval strategy sometimes hinged on astrology more than logistics. Astrologers were, in fact, military consultants. Kings employed them to choose battle dates, predict outcomes, and even plan troop movements. A general might delay a siege because Mars and Saturn were in opposition, or attack early if Jupiter looked friendly that morning. The irony was that the same astrologers sometimes gave opposite advice to both sides. But since medieval soldiers blamed fate rather than espionage, the stars never took the blame. Weapons had their own rituals. Swords, for instance, were often named and treated like living beings. A knight wouldn't dare use another's blade without proper blessing. It was like borrowing someone's soul. During consecration ceremonies, priests touched the sword to the altar and declared it a tool of righteousness. Of course, once the fighting began, it mostly became a tool of dismemberment. Still, faith in the blade's holiness gave courage when common sense failed. Even banners carried superstitions. A tattered flag was bad luck, while a spotless one suggested cowardice. Clearly, your side hadn't been fighting hard enough. Losing your banner in battle was worse than losing your commander. It was seen as divine humiliation. Soldiers risked their lives to retrieve fallen flags, not just for honour, but to keep misfortune from spreading. War was a mix of metal and metaphor, a dance where morale depended on miracles. Animals too became accidental omens. If a raven flew over the army, it meant doom. If a white horse neighed before battle, it signalled victory. Dogs howling in camp were dreadful signs, while cats sneezing, for reasons still unclear, meant good luck. The medieval war camp was basically a zoo of interpretations. One pigeon in the wrong direction could unsettle a whole regiment. Some warriors also practiced divination before battle. They'd cast dice, draw lots, or observe the way candles burned in the chapel. If the flame flickered toward the enemy, victory was assured. If it sputtered out, the men started writing wills. Fortune-telling on the eve of combat was an ancient comfort that never quite disappeared, no matter how loudly priests condemned it. And speaking of priests, chaplains served as both spiritual advisors and battlefield exorcists. Before charging, they'd bless the troops, sprinkle holy water on their weapons, and occasionally carry relics into the fray. One chronicler noted an army in the 12th century that marched under a fragment of the true cross. Confidence was high until the relic was captured, after which morale dropped faster than armour in a swamp. Even in retreat, superstition lingered. Soldiers returning from war carried purification rituals to cleanse themselves of blood guilt and bad luck. Some bathed in holy water, others burned their boots, believing the soil from foreign lands carried spirits home. A few simply avoided talking about battle altogether, afraid that recounting it would summon the dead. The line between psychological trauma and spiritual contamination was blurry, but the need for ritual was real. Women also joined in the superstitions of war, though from the sidelines. Wives and mothers stitched protective symbols into clothing or tied red threads around soldiers' wrists before departure. Some baked small charms into bread, so a bite of it during the march offered a divine flavour. Soldiers kept these tokens close, not just for luck, but as proof that someone believed in their safe return. The truth is, superstition was the soldier's way of managing chaos. In a world where one arrow could end your story, believing in fate was easier than believing in chance. It turned fear into ritual, panic into pattern. War was terrifying, but if your side carried the right relic, avoided the wrong day, and marched under the proper star, then maybe, God was on your payroll. The good news, faith gave courage. The bad news, strategy occasionally lost to astrology. But to a medieval warrior, that was a fair price to pay for hope. They weren't just fighting for glory, they were fighting against the universe's bad mood, one charm and crossed finger at a time. Next, we'll leave the battlefield behind and enter the home, where even the humble fireplace was ruled by superstition. Because in the Middle Ages, cooking dinner wasn't just domestic work, it was a delicate negotiation with fate, fire, and whatever spirit happened to be living in your chimney. Domestic life brimmed with omens, upside-down bread, black cats, and shoe curses. Forget taxes. Your biggest fear was your breadloaf offending a saint. The medieval home wasn't just a shelter, it was a miniature battlefield between good fortune and chaos, where every squeaky floorboard and flickering candle carried cosmic significance. To modernise, the average medieval household might seem humble. A thatched roof, a smoky hearth, a few chickens wandering in for dinner uninvited. But to its inhabitants, that same home was a sacred fortress of luck. The house was alive with unseen energies, benevolent spirits if you were virtuous, mischievous ones if you weren't. The goal of daily life wasn't comfort, it was spiritual pest control. Bread, the staple of existence, carried enormous symbolic weight. It represented not just food but divine blessing. Every loaf was cross-marked before baking to ward off evil spirits, and conveniently to keep it from exploding in the oven. But woe betide the fool who placed bread upside down on the table. That wasn't bad manners, it was a declaration of war against heaven. Bakers and priests alike agreed that upside-down bread invited the devil to dinner. Some said it signalled an execution nearby, others claimed it tempted famine itself. Either way, no one risked it. If the loaf tipped, the entire family performed a mini exorcism involving the sign of the cross and awkwardly writing it like a moral apology. Black cats were another domestic dilemma. Depending on your village, they were either lucky charms or demonic spies. Sailors adored them for warding off storms, but farmers often chased them away, convinced witches sent them as familiars. A cat crossing your threshold at dawn could mean prosperity. Crossing at night meant doom. Some households kept both a white and a black cat, just to balance their cosmic bets. And heaven help the person who accidentally stepped on one. Hurting a cat was said to bring 7 years of misery, fleas, or both. Shoes, surprisingly, were magical objects too. Because they touched the ground, that suspicious realm where demons, disease and bad luck mingled, they needed ritual handling. Putting your shoes on the wrong feet invited disaster. Leaving them upside down meant misfortune was already lurking. And if someone gifted you new shoes, you had to cross them before wearing, literally drawing a small cross with chalk, or risk walking straight into the devil's patience testing program. On the brighter side, their old shoes were reused as protective charms. Some were hidden in walls or under floorboards to trap evil spirits, a practice so common that archaeologists still find curse shoes tucked into centuries-old houses. The hearth, the beating heart of medieval domesticity, was equally sacred. Fire symbolised both life and danger, a friend that could turn traitor in seconds. To spill salt into the fire was to insult the household spirit. To let it die overnight meant inviting ghosts to warm their toes. Families made a ritual of feeding the last embers before bed, whispering blessings as they stirred the coals. The phrase keeping the home fires burning wasn't poetic, it was spiritual maintenance. Even cleaning had its rituals. Sweeping after sunset was taboo, believed to sweep away the house's luck. Dropping crumbs carelessly angered house spirits known as brownies or kobolds, who might retaliate by hiding spoons or souring milk. And heaven forbid you broke a dish, not because of cost, but because broken pottery symbolised broken fortune. Many homes buried shards near doorways to trap bad luck trying to sneak in. Water had its own rules. Drawing water from the well at night was risky. Spirits were said to dwell beneath the surface, eager to pull the curious down. The first water drawn each morning was considered holy and often sprinkled around the house to keep disease at bay. Some families even whispered blessings into the bucket before lowering it, because you never knew what might be listening down there. The threshold, that innocent strip between inside and out, was the most symbolically loaded part of the house. You never handed anything through a doorway. It broke the circle of protection. Guests had to fully step inside before receiving bread, gifts, or gossip. Couples were carried across the threshold not out of romance but caution, to prevent the bride's heel from brushing away the home's luck. Even doormats didn't escape suspicion. Some were woven with protective runes to keep wandering spirits at bay. Animals shared the household's spiritual burdens. Chickens crowing at odd hours foretold death. Dogs howling at midnight signalled spirits passing by. If a bird flew into your home, someone close was doomed, unless you bribed fate by tossing crumbs out the window and politely asking it to leave. Rural life, already full of unpredictable beasts, now included the added anxiety that they might all be supernatural messengers. Children learned these superstitions early. Mothers taught them never to whistle indoors, it summoned demons, and to always say bless you after sneezing, not for politeness, but to keep their soul from escaping. Little girls braided ribbons to protect against the evil wind, while boys wore iron rings to repel curses. Childhood was a crash course in anxiety management via folklore. Even architecture reflected these beliefs. Houses were often built facing east, toward the rising sun and away from the shadowy west. Windows were small, partly for warmth, partly to discourage spirits from peeking in, and chimneys were capped with carved faces or iron crosses to scare off whatever tried to drop in uninvited. A medieval architect didn't just design homes, he designed fortresses of faith. For all its absurdities, household superstition had purpose. It turned the chaos of daily survival into manageable rituals. Each gesture, crossing bread, hanging shoes, whispering blessings, gave the illusion of control in a world where control barely existed. It made families feel that even the smallest acts could keep disaster at bay. The good news? These habits filled homes with a sense of order and meaning. The bad news? You could ruin your luck by tripping over your own broom. Still, for medieval families, every crumb, cat and candle mattered. Their homes were more than places to sleep. They were sacred microcosms of the universe, defended by faith, firelight, and a spectacular amount of paranoia. Next, we'll step beyond the doorway and into the fields, where farmers face not just weather and hunger, but a pantheon of agricultural superstitions. Because in the medieval countryside, even your scarecrow had better be on speaking terms with the saints. Courtship meant charms, potions, and celestial matchmaking. Romance in the Middle Ages wasn't a matter of chemistry, and it was a dangerous cocktail of superstition, symbolism, and mild witchcraft. Dating advice: bury an apple under your pillow. If it rots, congratulations, you're married. In a world where survival was a daily miracle, love seemed too unpredictable to leave to chance. People wanted guarantees, not just emotional ones, but cosmic ones. Every glance, gift, and wedding date came with spiritual fine print. Falling in love wasn't just risky, it was potentially cursed if you didn't follow the proper rituals. Medieval lovers had an entire folklore of flirtation. Forget flowers or chocolates, those were for future centuries. Courtship began with omens. If a woman saw a robin before breakfast, it meant she'd marry a sailor. A sparrow meant poverty, a goldfinch meant wealth. Seeing a dead crow, on the other hand, meant she should consider the convent. Love wasn't blind, it was heavily superstitious. Charm-making became the medieval version of matchmaking apps. Young men and women carried small tokens of affection, often blessed by priests, or at least by someone who owned a candle. A lock of hair wrapped in ribbon, a pebble inscribed with initials, or a sprig of rosemary tied with thread. All were thought to carry binding energy. If the object was kept close to the heart, it supposedly linked the souls. Some took it literally, and wore charms until they rotted, ensuring at least one part of the relationship was everlasting. Astrology ruled the realm of romance. Lovers consulted the stars before making any serious move. The moon's phase dictated when to propose. Venus and Mars determined compatibility. Noble families even hired astrologers to compare horoscopes before arranging marriages. Yes, they're both rich, an astrologer might say, but Mars is in retrograde, so expect turbulence. The church disapproved of astrology, of course, but nobles ignored that. Love, like land, was too valuable not to double-check with the cosmos. Love potions were another medieval specialty, half alchemy, half kitchen disaster. Recipes promised to inspire passion, loyalty, or in some cases, mild hallucination. Common ingredients included herbs like vervain, myrrh, or basil. Rarer versions added powdered gemstones or a drop of blood. The logic was beautifully absurd. Mix a little danger with devotion and you'd get romance. The problem was that most potions worked less like magic and more like laxatives. Nothing kills the mood like unpredictable side effects. Divination for love was an especially popular pastime. Women dropped flower petals into water, watching how they floated to predict who loved them back. Apples were used constantly. Their seeds, peels, even their bounce. Peel an apple in one long strip and toss it over your shoulder. It would form the initial of your future spouse, unless it just looked like an S, in which case everyone in town became a suspect. Others buried apples under pillows to dream of their destined one. If they dreamed nothing, they woke up relieved. Oh, the commitment issues were timeless. Weddings themselves were drenched in superstition. Choosing the wrong day could doom the marriage before it began. Monday was for wealth, Tuesday for health, Wednesday for luck, but never Friday, the day of Christ's death. Marrying in May was especially unlucky thanks to an old proverb, marry in May and rue the day. June, however, was blessed, not because of divine reason, but because it followed bathing season, meaning people smelled slightly less cursed. The ceremony had its own safeguards. The bride wore her hair loose to symbolize purity, but tied a blue ribbon somewhere to keep jealous spirits away. Her veil wasn't just modesty, it was armour against the evil eye. Guests threw rice, a symbol of fertility, and made as much noise as possible to confuse lurking demons. Even the wedding ring had a protective function. It wasn't just a symbol of love, but a literal charm, a closed circle to trap fate inside. Shoes played a peculiar role in nuptial luck. Some brides received a wedding shoe, blessed by a priest, which she'd tap 3 times on the threshold before entering her new home. If she tripped, it meant trouble. If she stepped firmly, the marriage would be solid. Guests often tied old shoes to the back of the departing carriage, not for decoration, but to scare away malevolent spirits trying to hitch a ride. But the greatest fear of all was the love curse. Romantic rejection could lead to accusations of enchantment. If a suitor's advances were ignored, he might claim the woman had bewitched him into obsession, a handy excuse for stalking. In turn, women accused of casting love spells could face punishment or exile. It was safer to pretend you didn't know any herbs at all. Medieval flirtation often ended in marriage or witchcraft charges, sometimes both. Not every superstition was about fear, though. Some were tender attempts at comfort. Lovers exchanged vows under the stars, believing their words travelled to heaven and stayed there forever. A shared candle flame meant their souls were joined. A kiss given under a full moon was eternal, though likely chilly. In a world so unstable, these tiny rituals gave love a sense of permanence, even if everyone secretly knew it was hanging by the thread of fate. The good news? Love survived. Awkward, dramatic, and occasionally poisonous, but alive. The bad news? So did the rituals. Even centuries later, echoes of these medieval beliefs remain. Lucky wedding days, garter tosses, something borrowed, something blue. Behind the lace and champagne lies the same old fear that love, left unguarded, might offend the cosmos. Next, we'll wander into the nursery, where babies arrive surrounded not by balloons or lullabies, but by 1,000 tiny superstitions. Because in the Middle Ages, childbirth wasn't just a miracle, it was an all-out negotiation with destiny. The dead lingered everywhere, haunting homes, fields, and bad dreams. To the medieval mind, death wasn't an ending, it was a social inconvenience that refused to leave. Every creak in the floorboards was either the wind or Uncle Geoffrey checking on his will. Death in the Middle Ages was never private. It stalked every street, whispered in every churchyard, and occasionally fell directly into your stew via plague. Life expectancy was short, coffins were expensive, and theology made sure no one relaxed about what came next. Heaven was beautiful, hell was terrifying, and purgatory was basically divine waiting room torture. And while priests promised salvation, most people lived convinced that the dead were only one bad prayer away from showing up again. The line between the living and the dead was perilously thin. Graves weren't barriers, they were doorways. The church said souls rested, but villagers swore otherwise. Ghosts wandered freely, some to beg for prayers, others to collect debts, and a few just to complain about the living's noise. Cemeteries weren't spooky in the medieval sense. They were communal spaces. Markets took place beside them, children played among tombstones, and churches built homes for their parishioners right up against burial grounds. You might wake up each morning literally next door to your ancestors, a terrifying thought if you still owed them money. Every region had its favourite type of ghost. There were revenants, the reanimated dead who returned to terrorise their villages until a priest reburied them with the right Latin or a shovel to the face. There were white ladies, tragic souls of women who died unjustly and now haunted Crossroads, probably giving moral advice and chills in equal measure. And there were knocking spirits, who made strange sounds in houses, possibly rats, but no one wanted to test the theory after dark. The cause of ghostly unrest was usually spiritual paperwork gone wrong. If someone died unconfessed, excommunicated, or with unfinished business, say forgetting to return a borrowed cow, their soul couldn't move on. People left offerings, candles, bread, coins, on graves to help ease them into peace. Sometimes entire towns organised masses for the restless dead, a kind of collective customer service for ghosts who refused to take eternity's hint. But superstition made the problem worse. Medieval people believed spirits could enter homes through cracks, chimneys, or even keyholes. So doors were sealed with crosses, windows were laced with holy water, and, in desperate times, garlic hung everywhere. Sleeping with shoes pointing toward the bed was bad luck, since it mimicked the way corpses were laid out. Mirrors were covered after a death, lest the departing soul get confused and move in permanently. In short, your house became a barricade against the world's most awkward guests. Burial customs were equal parts faith and fear. Corpses were washed, wrapped, and laid out with candles to light their way and keep demons from snatching them mid-journey. Some graves included anti-resurrection measures, stones placed over the body, stakes through the chest, or iron bars to keep the dead from walking. These weren't vampire myths yet, just standard over caution. The medieval motto was simple: trust in God, but also nail the coffin shut. Churchyards were spiritual highways. It was said that souls lingered for up to 30 days after death, circling the earth in confusion. Family members left food and lighted lanterns by the door to guide them home one last time. Some even set out chairs in case Grandma's ghost wanted to rest after her celestial commute. On All Souls' Eve, the boundary between worlds supposedly thinned, and villagers claimed to see spectral processions gliding toward the church, pale figures with candles, walking the roads in eerie silence. Medieval nightlife was apparently heavy on ambience. Dreams played a major role in the afterlife's PR campaign. People believed the dead communicated through dreams, often demanding prayers or confessions on their behalf. If you ignored a ghost's message, you risked illness or worse. Monks wrote down these visions, interpreting them as proof of purgatory's existence. Souls literally texting the living from spiritual limbo. The takeaway? Always listen to your dead relatives. They might be haunting you for your own good. Not all ghosts were malicious, though. Some were guardians. The spirit of a benevolent ancestor could protect the family home, warn of danger, or help locate lost livestock. Farmers even poured milk on grave mounds to feed friendly spirits, ensuring good harvests and happy ghosts. In a strange way, death was part of community life. Your family just expanded to include those who didn't breathe anymore. Artists and theologians kept the conversation alive, quite literally. Medieval art depicted death as a skeleton, often holding an hourglass or scythe, leading processions of popes, peasants, and kings alike. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular motif, a grim reminder that everyone, no matter their station, would end up as bones. Church walls were painted with skeletons inviting nobles to waltz, cheerful decor for the age of existential dread. And then there were the death omens. Seeing a white bird fly into your house, someone would die. Hearing a church bell ring by itself, also death. Breaking a candle during Mass, death again. The medieval imagination had no shortage of exit announcements, but rather than paralysing people, it made them strangely pragmatic. Death wasn't an intruder. It was a neighbour you prepared tea for. The good news? Everyone was guaranteed an afterlife. The bad news? You might spend eternity stuck in your old village watching your descendants mismanage the farm. Yet even in all that fear, there was comfort. The dead weren't gone. They were simply relocated. The medieval world was a crowded stage. Its players divided between the living, the dead, and the indecisive. Next, we'll follow those restless souls into the shadows of churchyards and crossroads, where the medieval night came alive with the creatures of legend, spirits, monsters, and things best left unnamed. Because if the dead couldn't scare you, the things that weren't quite dead certainly would. Every job had rituals for luck, mixing prayer with spit and superstition. In the medieval workplace, you didn't just clock in, you invoked cosmic insurance. Before work, pray. During work, spit. After work, hope your hammer wasn't cursed. Work was never just work in the Middle Ages. It was a delicate dance with unseen forces. Every tool had a soul, every trade a patron saint, and every mistake a potential invitation for divine correction. Whether you were a blacksmith, miller, mason, or farmer, success depended as much on ritual as on skill. Productivity wasn't measured in hours, it was measured in blessings. Let's start with the blacksmith, the fiery heart of medieval superstition. His forge was both workshop and shrine. Iron, after all, was sacred stuff. It scared demons, sealed doors, and made weapons that supposedly glowed when evil approached, though that might have been wishful thinking. Before lighting the forge each morning, a blacksmith would mutter a prayer to St. Dunstan, patron of metalworkers, famously the man who once pinched the devil's nose with tongs. Some blacksmiths even spat on their hammers for luck, not because it helped, but because tradition said the devil hated the sound. Imagine beginning your day by threatening hell with bad manners. Masons were equally ritualistic. Every new building began with blessing, candles, and an uncomfortable amount of chanting. Laying the first stone required ceremony. Coins were sometimes buried beneath it to attract prosperity, and the cornerstone was sprinkled with wine to seal good fortune. Tools weren't just wiped clean, they were baptized. Dropping a hammer was a serious omen, especially if it landed head up. That meant an accident was coming. Workers might counter it by tapping the stone 3 times and whispering, "St. Vincent, guide my hand." It was superstition disguised as quality control. Farmers were lived by an entire liturgical calendar of rituals. Each task, sowing, ploughing, harvesting, had its own set of spiritual precautions. You couldn't just plant seeds, you had to greet the soil. On the first day of ploughing, a farmer often paused to feed his oxen bread blessed by a priest, ensuring both strength and divine appreciation for the coming season. Spitting on the first furrow was another charm, a rustic baptism of the land. The logic went, if the earth had to swallow anything, better saliva than your luck. Millers, who turned grain to gold, were viewed with both awe and suspicion. Their mills, full of rumbling wheels and constant motion, felt supernatural. Many believed millstones turned with the help of hidden spirits. To keep them cooperative, millers left offerings, a pinch of flour, a coin, or, on particularly desperate days, a whispered compliment to whatever invisible thing kept the gears spinning. No wonder they were thought to be in league with devils. They literally worked into places that groaned all night. Sailors, meanwhile, turned superstition into performance art. Before setting sail, the crew performed a checklist of rituals that made modern air travel look casual. No one whistled. It was said to summon storms. No one mentioned rabbits, apparently cursed animals at sea. Cats were good luck, women were bad luck, and cutting your hair before departure guaranteed shipwreck. To ensure a safe voyage, sailors spat on the deck, kissed the mast, and poured ale into the sea as a peace offering to the waves. By the time they left port, they were half drunk, half blessed, and fully convinced Poseidon had read the memo. Weavers, tailors, and spinners also had their charms, quite literally. Threadwork carried mystical associations because it imitated the divine act of creation. Women whispered prayers to St. Anne while spinning wool, believing tangled thread foretold illness. Tailors never left unfinished garments overnight, or spirits might finish the job badly. Dropping scissors was unlucky. Stepping on them guaranteed a cut before week's end. Some kept iron needles stuck in door frames to stab any evil that tried to sneak in. Even bakers, the most fragrant of labourers, kept to their superstitious routines. Bread wasn't just food, it was holy. Before mixing dough, bakers crossed the flour to bless it, and before baking they tapped the oven 3 times for luck. If a loaf cracked oddly, it meant bad news. If it rose beautifully, it meant divine favour. And woe to anyone who whistled near the oven. The devil, they said, hated competition for blowing hot air. Artists, scribes and scholars weren't immune either. Illuminators who copied sacred texts prayed before opening their inks, lest they misspell the name of God and summon trouble. Some wore rings engraved with psalms to steady their hands. Musicians tuned their instruments in silence on Fridays, believing sound carried straight to heaven on that day. Even mathematicians crossed themselves before writing a 7, the number of perfection, but also the number most likely to anger spirits of disorder if drawn poorly. Every craft had a guardian saint, a kind of celestial manager. Saint Luke for painters, Saint Eligius for metal workers, Saint Isidore for farmers. Workers invoked their saints with short chants, carving their names into tools or painting them on walls. These divine supervisors were expected to handle workplace hazards, bad weather, and occasional laziness. If something went wrong, you didn't blame yourself. You blamed St. Luke for taking a long lunch. But the real purpose of these rituals wasn't just fear, it was control. Medieval life was unpredictable. Storms, plagues, and taxes arrived without warning. Ritual turned chaos into routine. A whispered blessing or a bit of spit transformed anxiety into action. Each superstition gave meaning to randomness, turning work into a spiritual partnership. You didn't just build a wall or bake bread, you participated in the cosmic order, and hopefully didn't offend it. And yes, the workplace had its share of comic contradictions. A mason might refuse to start work on a dark day, but happily climb a half-finished tower in the rain. A sailor might avoid whistling for fear of storms, but sing shanties about shipwrecks. A farmer might spit for luck, then complain when the soil turned muddy. Superstition wasn't logic, it was a lifestyle. The good news? These habits gave work a rhythm and purpose. The bad news? Forgetting one could ruin your whole week, or so everyone believed. In the medieval world, faith wasn't reserved for churches. It lived in every hammer strike, every kneaded loaf, every whispered prayer over a stubborn sheep. Next, we'll travel from the fields and forges to the heart of medieval entertainment, the festivals, fairs, and holy days where superstition and celebration collided. Because in a society haunted by fear, even joy needed rules to keep the devil off the guest list. Old fears survive in modern habits, knocking on wood, crossing fingers, reading horoscopes. We've traded talismans for phone charms. Same nonsense, better Wi-Fi. The Middle Ages may be long gone, but its ghosts linger in every ritual we perform without thinking. We like to believe we're rational now, enlightened by science and reason, but one spilled salt shaker, and we're flinging grains over our shoulder like nervous peasants. The truth is, medieval superstition never really died, it just rebranded. Modern people still crave the same thing their ancestors did, a sense of control over chaos. We no longer fear demons lurking in chimneys, usually, but we still knock on wood to keep luck from noticing our arrogance. We avoid walking under ladders, not because we think Satan's up there, but because centuries ago the triangle shape was holy and passing through it was like photobombing the Holy Trinity. Old theology, new excuse for caution. Crossing your fingers is another leftover charm, originally a symbol of calling on Christ's protection. Two people would cross fingers together as a mini prayer before a risky act, like confessing love or committing theft. Over time, people learned to multitask, crossing their own fingers and calling it a day. Now we do it for luck, never realizing we're performing a 1,000-year-old micro-blessing every time we hope for a raise or a stable Wi-Fi signal. Salt, the medieval world's most sacred seasoning, still makes modern people weirdly nervous. Spilling it was once thought to summon misfortune because salt symbolized purity, permanence, and divine covenant. Losing it meant losing protection, so naturally, people countered the curse by throwing a pinch over the left shoulder, directly into the devil's eye. Fast forward to today and we're still doing it. Lucifer must be fed up with humanity's table manners by now. Horoscopes too are medieval time travellers. Astrology, once a scholarly field studied by monks and royal mathematicians, has been reincarnated as smartphone entertainment. Medieval kings consulted star charts before wars. Now we check ours before first dates. But the impulse is the same, to find meaning in the unpredictable. Saturn's retrograde may no longer delay crusades, but it still gets blamed for bad Wi-Fi and breakups. Even our obsession with lucky numbers and bad vibes comes straight out of medieval numerology. The number 13 is still the villain of elevators, airplanes, and hotel floors, because Judas sat 13th at the Last Supper. Friday remains unlucky thanks to the same event, Christ's crucifixion, which made Friday a day of mourning. And good luck itself? That phrase originated as a Christian prayer, Godspeed, now repackaged into something you can text before a job interview. Weddings, perhaps more than any other ceremony, carry medieval echoes. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue wasn't Victorian, it's medieval risk management in rhyme. Blue was the colour of purity, borrowed items carried blessings, and old represented continuity. We still toss rice, once grain offerings, to fertility gods, and tie shoes or cans to wedding cars, a direct descendant of the old belief that noise scared away spirits jealous of human happiness. Every modern honeymoon begins with the same ancient premise. Celebrate loudly so ghosts don't crash the marriage. Superstition even crept into language. bless you after a sneeze was once a literal spiritual safeguard. Sneezing meant your soul briefly escaped, and if someone didn't bless you quickly enough, demons might move in. We now do it automatically, even if we're atheists. The gesture remains, though the theology's long gone. In a way, that's the magic of superstition. Its ability to outlive the belief that birthed it. Our homes, too, echo medieval paranoia in subtle ways. Hanging horseshoes above doors, straight from the 14th century when iron was thought to repel spirits. Avoiding broken mirrors? That's medieval soul theory. Reflections were believed to contain fragments of one's essence, and breaking the glass meant damaging yourself spiritually. Today it's just bad luck, but the root is ancient fear polished by time. Even technology has found ways to accommodate old instincts. Where once people carried saintly medals, we now keep lucky phone charms or background screens set to zodiac signs. Athletes still perform ritual gestures before games. Students carry lucky pens. Businessmen check their good days on astrology apps before big deals. The medieval village hasn't vanished, it's just gone digital. The Wi-Fi connects, the candles are virtual, but the desire to negotiate with fate remains the same. Of course we laugh at medieval superstition, garlic necklaces, moon curses, and holy relics come the scams, but our laughter hides recognition. Humans never stopped needing magic. We just learned to disguise it. Rituals soothe what logic can't fix. Whether we're rubbing lucky rabbit feet or refreshing weather apps, we're all trying to reason with the universe. The only difference is our vocabulary. Even science, for all its triumph, has its rituals of belief. We still whisper to dice, cross our fingers before test results, and refuse to say something's going well, for fear of jinxing it. These are not rational behaviours, they're cultural fossils. Each superstition is a relic of medieval fear adapted for modern anxiety. The ghosts of our ancestors still sit beside us, less visible now, but still humming in the background of our habits. Yet perhaps that's not entirely bad. Medieval superstition, for all its absurdities, gave people comfort. It turned a chaotic, dangerous world into something structured, even if only by illusion. Knocking on wood, crossing fingers, throwing salt, these are small ways of saying I acknowledge the uncertainty, but I'll try to charm it anyway. They're fragments of hope disguised as reflexes. The good news? Humanity never lost its imagination. The bad news? We're still a species terrified of jinxing ourselves. But maybe superstition isn't weakness. Maybe it's poetry surviving in a rational world. The medieval peasant whispered to saints. We whisper to algorithms. Either way, we're still asking the same timeless question. Please, just let it go right this time. And with that, our journey through the medieval world of fear and faith comes full circle, from demons in the shadows to emojis of luck on our phones. The good news, the fleas are gone. The bad news, the fear never left, or it just learned how to use Wi-Fi.